Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going somewhere bright. We are going somewhere busy. We are going somewhere where the streets are full of horses and motor cars and trams and bicycles and people, where the shops have, in their windows, the most beautiful goods that the British Empire and most of Europe and a fair portion of the rest of the world can supply, where the great hotels are taking their guests in for breakfast, where the newspaper sellers on the corners are calling out the morning headlines, and where, beyond the thick coal smoke haze that hangs over the rooftops, the dome of St. Paul's and the spire of St. Martin in the Fields and the pale arc of the Royal Albert Hall are visible at varying distances depending on which street you are standing on and which way you happen to be looking. We are going to London. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. We are going to a particular London, which is the London of the autumn of 1908, in the 7th year of the reign of King Edward VII. We are going to spend the whole of one ordinary day there, from the grey light of the early morning to the deep gaslit dark of the late evening. We are going to walk. We are going to look at the streets and the shops and the parks and the people. We are going to eat at the kinds of places where the people of this London ate in the autumn of 1908. We are going to ride, when we need to, on the buses and the trams and the underground trains and the hansoms and the motor cabs that the city was, at this particular moment in its history, providing for its inhabitants in considerable variety. We are going to do, in short, what a person in London on this particular October day would do, and we are going to do it slowly, with the careful attention to the Edwardian sensory details that the slowness allows. The day, as we begin it, is the 8th of October. It is a Thursday. The weather, by the forecast in the morning newspapers, is set fair, with temperatures rising into the low 60s Fahrenheit by the middle of the day, with light winds from the southeast, and with no particular threat of rain before the evening. The sky, when we step out of the hotel where we have been staying, is the pale blue-grey that London's autumn skies habitually present, with the permanent haze of the city's coal smoke giving the blue a softness that is in its own way characteristic of the place. The air is cool but not cold. The pavement, wet from the night's dew, is just beginning to dry in the patches where the morning sun is reaching it. The street in front of the hotel is already busy with the early traffic of the city's working morning. We are in a private hotel on Jermyn Street, between St. James's Square and Piccadilly. The hotel is the sort of hotel that respectable single travellers and the families of country gentry take when they come up to London for a few days. It has perhaps 20 rooms. It has a dining room on the ground floor where breakfast is served. It has a writing room with a fire and a few newspapers laid out on a side table. It has a porter at the front door in a dark green coat with brass buttons. The porter, when we step out, touches his hat to us. He says good morning. He asks whether we wish him to call a cab. We say no, thank you, we are going to walk. He inclines his head. We turn east and start walking along Jermyn Street toward Piccadilly Circus, which is perhaps a quarter of a mile away. The smell of London, in October 1908, is one of the sensory features that any visitor will, in due course, register. The first element is the smell of coal smoke. The city, in this period, burns coal as its main fuel for almost every domestic and commercial purpose. Every house has its coal fire in every room that is used through the colder months. Every shop has its coal stove. Every kitchen, in every restaurant and tea room and lodging house, has its coal range. Every public building has its coal heating system, with the chimneys rising from every roof in the city, contributing their individual columns of smoke to the accumulated cloud above the rooftops. The result on most days of the autumn and winter is the permanent grey haze that hangs over the city, with the thicker concentrations on still days when the natural ventilation does not disperse the smoke, and the thinner concentrations on windier days when the smoke is carried away to the east on the prevailing wind. The smell of the coal smoke in any street and at any hour is the constant background note of the London air, and the visitor who has been in the city for any length of time begins to register the smell only when he leaves the city for a few days and returns to find the smell on his re-entry, suddenly newly perceptible before his nose adjusts to it again. Smell of the coal smoke is mixed throughout the central districts with the smell of horses and the smell of horse manure that the still numerous horse traffic produces, with the smell of cooking from the chop houses and tea shops, with the smell of cigars and pipe tobacco from the steady stream of smokers on the pavements, with the individual perfumes and tobaccos and waxes and leathers that the well-dressed pedestrians carry in their individual personal microclimates. The whole of the air, taken all together, is the air of London at its peak, and the air, in its composite character, is one of the things that the people who live in this city know, and that the visitors recognise as the distinctive sensory signature of the place. Jermyn Street, in October 1908, is one of the specialist shopping streets of the West End of London. It runs parallel to Piccadilly, between Regent Street and St James's Street, and it is famous among the population of gentlemen who shop there for its shirts. The shirt makers of Jermyn Street are, in this period, the main source of the bespoke shirts that the Edwardian gentleman wears under his frock coat or his lounge suit. The windows of the shops as we walk past them display, in carefully arranged compositions, the various bolts of fine cotton and linen and silk from which the shirts are made. There are, on this quarter mile of street, perhaps 20 shirt makers, each with its carefully painted name above its door, each with its bow window and its carefully arranged display, each with the understated dignity that the trade considers appropriate to its standing. The windows are not crowded. The windows do not, on the whole, advertise prices. The windows simply show the goods in the confident assumption that the customers who matter will recognize quality without having to be told about it. There are, beside the shirt makers, the other specialist trades that have settled along this street over the previous century. There is a hat maker, with a window full of bowlers and toppers and the soft tweed caps that gentlemen wear in the country. There is a glover, with a window of pale leather gloves arranged in pairs across a velvet display. There is a bootmaker, with a window of polished black and brown shoes, each pair on its own wooden last. There is a wine merchant, with a window of dark bottles and the white labels of the vintages, and the price cards that the trade still considers acceptable to display, although the prices themselves are not, by the standards of ordinary commerce, particularly low. There is a perfumer, whose window has a single elaborate cut glass bottle on a velvet cushion, with no other display, on the understanding that the customer who needs to ask what is in the bottle is not the customer the shop is interested in serving. The street is, at this hour, mostly quiet. The shops have not yet opened. The first shopmen are arriving, in their dark suits and their bowler hats, walking from the various omnibus stops and underground stations that have brought them in from the suburbs where they live, with the set keys in their hands ready for the front doors of the establishments where they work. They will, in the next quarter of an hour, unlock the doors, raise the blinds, dust the displays, and prepare the shops for the customers who will begin to arrive after 10. We watch them as we walk. They walk in twos and threes. They greet each other. They turn at their respective shops and begin the morning work of opening up. The pavement is being swept. There is ahead of us a man in the grey coat of the parish street sweepers, with his long-handled broom and his two-wheeled cart, working his way slowly along the gutter, gathering up the accumulations of the previous day's traffic. He is in his work principally concerned with the horse droppings, which are the most substantial and most frequent contribution that the traffic of any London street still makes to the surface of its road. London in 1908 is, in its main traffic, still a horse-drawn city. There are motor cars, there are motor buses, there are even, in increasing numbers, motor taxis. But the great mass of the city's daily transport is still pulled by horses, and the horses, in their hundreds of thousands of journeys each day across the streets of central London, leave behind them the accumulations that the sweepers, in their grey coats and their two-wheeled carts, work patiently to remove. The sweeper looks up as we pass. He does not speak. He returns to his work. The cart has on it the round shovel that the work requires. Piccadilly is at the end of the street. We can see it ahead of us, where Jermyn Street meets it just below the corner of the Royal Academy. The traffic on Piccadilly, at this hour of the morning, is already considerable. We hear it before we see it, the steady combined sound of hooves and iron-rimmed wheels, and the additional notes of motor horns, and the occasional shout of a driver to a horse or another driver, all combining into the sort of low-layered roar that the great London streets produce in their working hours. The roar will, over the course of the morning, build to its full intensity around 11 o'clock, and will hold there, with variations, for the rest of the working day. We have, at this hour, only the early version of it, but the early version is itself sufficient to establish the basic acoustic character of the morning. We come out onto Piccadilly. We turn left. We walk east toward Piccadilly Circus, which is perhaps another 3 minutes away on foot. The pavements of Piccadilly, at 8:30 in the morning, are filling with the early commercial traffic of the day. There are the shopmen and the shopgirls walking to their establishments. There are the office clerks walking to the various banks and insurance offices and solicitors' chambers in the City and the Strand. There are the group of well-dressed men walking, with their newspapers folded under their arms, toward the gentlemen's clubs that line Pall Mall and St. James's Street, and that are now, at this hour, beginning to receive their first members of the day for breakfast. There are, more occasionally, the carriages of private gentlemen, and the private motor cars of the wealthier private gentlemen, threading their way along the central part of the road between the larger commercial vehicles. There are the omnibuses, in their dark blue and red and green livery, with their open tops and their advertising signs along the sides, picking up and setting down their passengers at the fare stages that are marked, at this period, by hand-painted signs on the lamp-posts. There are the hansom cabs, with their drivers seated up high behind the two-wheeled cabs, and the four-wheeled growlers, slower and heavier, with their drivers seated on the box at the front, and the new motor taxis, of which a few hundred have appeared on the streets of London in the previous 2 years, with their drivers also at the front, but with the loud chugging engines that the older horse-drawn cabs do not possess, and the bicycle messengers, weaving between the larger vehicles with the easy confidence of young men who have been bicycling these streets for several years and who have learned, by practice, the geometry of survival in London traffic. We walk along the south side of Piccadilly, with the closed gates of Green Park on our right, and the great shops and clubs of the north side of the street on our left across the road. The shops on the north side are some of the oldest and most distinguished in London. Hatchard's, the booksellers, has been on this street since 1797. Fortnum and Mason, the grocers, has been on this street since 1707. which means that as we walk past it on this October morning, the shop is in its 201st year of trading on the same site. The shop's elaborate green and gold front, with the famous clock above the door, that will not, for another 56 years, acquire the mechanical figures that now make it one of London's tourist landmarks, presents itself to the passer-by with the confident dignity of an institution that has long since stopped feeling any need to advertise itself in the more aggressive ways that the newer shops down the street are starting to adopt. We do, however, on this morning, decide to go inside Hatchard's for a 10-minute browse. The doors of the bookshop are, like the doors of all the major Piccadilly establishments, wide open at this hour. We step inside. The shop is, in its interior, a particular kind of bibliographic institution. The walls are lined, floor to ceiling, with the dark wooden shelves that the bookshops of the day favoured, with the ladders on rails that allowed the assistants to reach the higher shelves. The floors are of polished dark wood. The air inside is the distinctive air of any old bookshop, the dry mineral smell of old paper, the warmer smell of leather bindings, the faint smell of the wax that the assistants use on the woodwork of the shelves. There are on the central tables the piles of the latest publications of the autumn season, with the handwritten cards giving the title and the price of each. There are on a special table near the front the selection of the recently published memoirs and biographies that the political class is particularly interested in this season. There is, in the back of the shop, a section devoted to the antiquarian books that the establishment has been buying and selling for over a century. We pick up a volume of poetry, look at it, set it down. We pick up a recently published novel by Mr. Wells, look at it, set it down. We do not, on this morning, buy. We are simply browsing. The assistant in the dark suit who has been hovering at a respectful distance, ready to help us if we wish to be helped, makes no attempt to press any of the books on us. We thank him, after our 10 minutes, with the slight inclination of the head that the conventions of the form require. He returns the inclination. We step back out, after a few moments, onto the pavement of Piccadilly. We continue walking. The traffic on the road continues. The early sun, which has been rising over the eastern edges of the city since before 7, is now fully above the rooftops of the buildings on the north side of the street, and the long, thin shadows that the buildings have been casting across the road have shortened to the autumn shadows of mid-morning. The light is the particular light of an October day in London, with the additional softness that the coal smoke haze gives it, and the buildings and the people and the vehicles in the street are all bathed in it in the same gentle way, as if the whole of the city were being seen through a thin layer of the finest possible muslin. The light is beautiful. The light, in its autumn way, is one of the features of October in London that the people who live here know and love, and that the visitors, in their surprised noticing of it, recognise, on the days when it is at its best, as one of the things that has brought them back. We arrive at Piccadilly Circus. The circus in 1908 is one of the most famous junctions in the city. It is the meeting point of Piccadilly, Regent Street, the Haymarket, and Coventry Street. At its centre, on an island in the middle of the swirling traffic, stands the bronze statue of Eros, which has been there for 15 years, and which the population of London has, in the humour of the city, decided to consider a representation of Anteros rather than Eros, although the question is, on the whole, of academic interest only. The statue is the work of the sculptor Alfred Gilbert. It was erected in 1893 as part of a memorial to the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, the Victorian philanthropist, whose work for the poor of London the statue is intended to commemorate. The statue is small, perhaps 8 feet high. It stands on a tall fountain base. It is now, by 1908, one of the landmarks of the West End that everyone in London knows, and that the population uses as a meeting place when they need somewhere to meet that does not require any further description than its four-word name. The circus is, at this hour, the fullest and busiest single space we have yet encountered in our walk. The traffic moves around the central island in a great slow swirl, with the various streams of vehicles entering and leaving by the four main streets, and with the confusion at the various meeting points that the absence of any formal traffic regulation tends to produce. The pavements around the circus are crowded. There are perhaps 200 people standing or walking on the pavements at the moment of our arrival, and the number is, by the steady arrival of new pedestrians from the various streets, growing rather than shrinking. There are on the pavements the stalls of the flower sellers, with their baskets of late chrysanthemums and bunches of violets, and the early imported roses that the London florists have been getting in increasing quantities from the south of France over the previous decade. There are the newspaper sellers, with their stands at the corners, calling out the morning's headlines in the particular loud sing-song cadence that London newspaper sellers have developed over generations. There are the boot blacks, set up with their stands at the curb, calling out for customers to step up and have their boots polished. There are the organ grinders with their barrel organs, playing, on this particular morning, a medley of popular tunes from the music halls of the previous season. And not. We stand for a moment at the corner of Piccadilly and Regent Street, watching the circus. The sound is enormous. The smell is the smell of a London street at its working hour, which is the smell of horses and coal smoke and the additional petrol fumes from the motor cars and the additional notes of the various foods being cooked on braziers by the few street vendors who have set up early, mixed with the individual smells of the perfumes and tobaccos and waxes and leathers that the well-dressed people passing on the pavement carry with them in their individual personal microclimates. The air, taken altogether, is the air of London. The air is, like the light, one of the features of the place that the people who live here know and that the visitors recognise. For now we keep walking this London from morning to deep night, with no particular destination and no particular task to accomplish, only the slow, patient attention to the details of the day that an evening of this kind calls for. There are many hours still ahead of us. We turn from Piccadilly Circus into Regent Street and begin to walk north. Regent Street in 1908 is one of the most architecturally distinctive streets in London. It was laid out in the early 19th century by John Nash as part of the great urban scheme that connected Carlton House at one end of it with Regent's Park at the other. And the original Nash buildings, with their great curved colonnades and their rounded shop fronts, are still in place along the southern part of the street, although they have, over the previous decade, begun to be discussed in the press as no longer adequate to the requirements of modern shopping and as candidates for replacement. The replacement, when it comes, will not begin until after the period we are now in, and the great rebuilding of Regent Street that will produce the present shop facades will be the work of the 1910s and 1920s. For now, in October 1908, the street still has its Nash quadrant, with the curved colonnade running south from Oxford Circus to Piccadilly Circus, and the old shops underneath the colonnade with their individual fronts and their individual histories. Liberty's is on this street. The shop, founded in 1875 by Arthur Liberty, has by 1908 become one of the most fashionable establishments in London for the sort of cultivated upper-middle-class customer who values the aesthetic movement style that the shop has, since its foundation, made its signature. The shop is famous for its oriental imports, for its silk fabrics in soft greens and dusty pinks and pale yellows, for its carefully chosen selection of furniture in the styles that William Morris and the followers of William Morris have, over the previous 30 years, brought to public attention. The window we pass is, this morning, dressed in the autumn collection, rich browns and ambers and touches of gold, with the central display a single carved Chinese cabinet on a low platform, and the various silk scarves and cushions and pieces of jewellery that the shop sells arranged around it in the careful tableau that the shop's window dressers have spent the previous evening composing. We stop briefly to look. The cabinet is beautiful. The arrangement is beautiful. The window, taken altogether, is one of the pleasures of walking up Regent Street in the late autumn of 1908, and the group of other passers-by who have also stopped to look at it confirms, by their attentive presence, that the window is doing the work that it was designed to do. We do, on this morning, decide to step inside Liberty's for a few minutes. We push open the door. The bell rings. We step in. The interior of Liberty's in 1908 is one of the most distinctive shop interiors in London. The walls are panelled in the dark wood that the founder considered appropriate to the aesthetic atmosphere he wished to create. The ceilings are low and beamed. The floors are of polished dark wood with Persian rugs scattered across them in the artful way that the shop's design considers proper. The lighting is in places by the electric lamps with fringed silk shades, and in other places by the natural light from the lidded windows that face the street. The air inside has the distinctive smell of the silks and the oriental woods, and the dried potpourri that the shop sells in open bowls on the display tables. There are, on the tables, the bolts of patterned silk in the soft colours of the autumn collection. There are, on the wall racks, the selection of imported Indian shawls and Chinese embroideries. There are, in an adjacent room visible through an arched doorway, the selection of furniture in the arts and crafts style. The whole of the interior is, by the careful design, a total environment, with each detail of the decoration consistent with the aesthetic philosophy that the shop has, since its foundation made its signature appeal. The assistant who comes forward to greet us is dressed in the dark dress that the shop's staff uniform requires, with the small embroidered Liberty pattern on the collar in place of the white linen that other establishments use. We tell her we are simply looking. She inclines her head. She withdraws to the respectful distance from which she will, if we summon her return. We walk slowly through the various rooms of the interior. We do not on this morning buy. We are simply looking. We absorb, in the 10 minutes we are inside, the immersive atmosphere of one of the most carefully designed shop interiors in London, and then we return, after a further inclination of the head to the assistant on our way out, to the pavement of Regent Street outside. We continue walking. We pass the various other shops along the quadrant. There is a glove maker. There is a jeweller. There is a milliner with a window full of the elaborate hats that the Edwardian women wear, with their ostrich feathers and their artificial flowers and their carefully arranged trims of velvet and silk. There is a stationer with a window of expensive note paper in the particular weights and watermarks that the Edwardian correspondence requires. There is a chocolatier with a window of dark chocolates arranged on white paper doilies, and the smell, as we pass, is the intoxicating smell of expensive chocolate that the well-equipped chocolatier is always going to produce at the door of his shop, with the calculated intention of bringing the casual passer-by inside. We do not, on this occasion, go in. We are saving our shopping for later in the morning, when the leading department stores have opened, and when the deeper part of our walking can be done. We continue, instead, north along Regent Street toward Oxford Circus, where the street meets Oxford Street, and where the larger and more recent shops of the Edwardian retail boom are concentrated. The newspaper sellers on the corner of Oxford Circus, when we pass them, are calling out the headlines of the morning's editions. There are, in 1908, perhaps a dozen daily papers that the West End reader of any standing reads. There is the Times, which is the leading serious paper and which the gentlemen at the clubs read in the morning, and which forms, by its unwavering authority, the main source of public opinion on the matters of the day. There is the Daily Telegraph, which is read by a slightly broader public. There is the Morning Post, which is the main paper of the Conservative landed interest. There is the New Daily Mail, founded in 1896 by the brothers Harmsworth, which has, in its dozen years of existence, become the leading mass circulation paper of the country, with its accessible style and its lower price of 1/2 penny rather than the penny that the older papers charged. There is the Daily Mirror, founded in 1903, which has just begun. In this period, the experiment of using photographs rather than engraved illustrations, and which is, by 1908, one of the most distinctive papers on the streets. There are, in addition, the various evening papers which the city's working population read on their commutes home. The Star, the Evening News, the Pall Mall Gazette, the Globe. The newspaper sellers, on this particular morning, are calling out the main items. A piece of news from the Olympic Games that have been held in London this summer and that have just concluded. A piece of political news about the ongoing debates in the House of Commons. A piece of foreign news about the developing situation in the Balkans. We do not, on this morning, buy a paper. We have in our detached holiday spirit no particular interest in following the daily news of the year. We continue past the sellers, with their distinctive call still in our ears as we walk on. We pass, near Oxford Circus, the entrance of the Oxford Circus station of the Bakerloo Railway, which has been open for 2 years. The London Underground, in October 1908, is in the middle of one of its major expansions. The deep tube lines that make up the modern underground system have, in the previous decade, been opening one by one. The Central London Railway, which we now know as the Central Line, has been running since 1900. The Bakerloo Railway opened in 1906. The Piccadilly Railway opened in December 1906. The Hampstead Tube, which we now know as the Northern Line's Charing Cross branch, opened in June of the present year. The system is, in this period, just acquiring the unified character that subsequent decades will give it. The various lines were built by separate private companies, each with its own distinctive station designs and its own fare structures and its own operational practices. The amalgamation of the various companies into the single underground network we now know is a process that the next 2 decades will complete. In 1908, the system is still a collection of competing private undertakings. Although the new Central Electric ticket-selling office that has just been established at Oxford Circus is starting to provide the unified passenger experience that will, in due course, become the system's signature appeal. The entrances at street level, however, are already distinctive. They have the oxblood red tile facades that the architect Leslie Green has been designing for the Bakerloo and Piccadilly stations, with the white lettering that announces the name of the station and the electric lights that mark the entrance in the evening. We do not, on this morning, descend into the station. We are above ground today. The underground, with its new tube trains and its electric lifts, and its steady warm air rising from the platforms below, is a different experience that we will save for another day. We descend briefly, on our way past Oxford Circus, into the entrance of the Bakerloo station, simply to look. The entrance hall, with its ticket window and its painted notice boards listing the fares to the various stations along the line, is in the new electric tile interior that Leslie Green stations all share. There is an electric lift with its folding metal gates that descends to the platform level perhaps 80 feet below. There is the distinctive warm air rising from the lift shaft, with the smell of brake dust and electricity, and the accumulated breath of the commuter population that has been passing through the station all morning. We do not, on this occasion, take a train. We simply stand for a moment in the ticket hall, taking in the atmosphere of the new transport system that the city has, in the previous decade, been constructing under its streets. We come back up to the pavement after a few moments, with the impression of the underground experience added to our accumulating picture of the city. But we are also, by this point, beginning to be hungry. We have been on our feet for almost an hour. We have not yet eaten. The breakfast at the hotel on Jermyn Street, which we declined in favour of an early start, is now beginning to seem, in retrospect, like an opportunity that we should perhaps have taken. We need to eat. There are, fortunately, several options very close to where we now are. London in 1908 is for the visitor in need of breakfast almost embarrassingly well supplied. The Lion's tea shops, which have been multiplying across the West End since the company was founded in 1894, are now present in considerable numbers. The first Lion's Corner House, the much larger establishment that the company will become famous for in the interwar period, has not yet opened. The first one will appear on Coventry Street, just east of where we are standing, in 1909. But the smaller standard Lion's tea shops are already a familiar feature of every major London street, with their cream-painted fronts and their gold lettering, and their reliable supply of tea and toast and expensive meals. There are also the older ABC tea shops, the Aerated Bread Company tea shops, which have been operating since the 1860s, and which, although somewhat less fashionable than the newer Lyons branches, are still ubiquitous in the West End and the city. There are the various coffee houses, of which a number still survive from earlier centuries. There are the chop houses and grill rooms, although these are more lunch and supper establishments than breakfast ones, and there are the breakfast rooms of the great hotels, which serve at this hour the most elaborate and most expensive of the available meals. We are, on this morning, in the mood for something simple. We turn off Regent Street into one of the side streets and walk a few steps to a Lion's tea shop that we know is there. The tea shop is on the corner. Its front is the standard Lion's cream and gold. Its windows have in their displays the advertising cards for the meals available and the fixed pricing that the chain is famous for keeping consistent across all its branches. We push open the door. The bell on the inside of the door rings. We step in. The tea shop is the standard Lyons design. It has perhaps 30 marble-topped tables, arranged in the rows that make the most of the available floor space. The tables have on each one a white china sugar bowl, a white china cream jug, and a printed menu card on a metal stand. The chairs are bentwood, in the dark stain that the chain has standardized on. The walls are, between waist height and ceiling, a pale cream color, with a darker dado below. The lighting is electric, in the relatively new electric pendant fittings that the chain has been installing across its branches as the West End's electrical supply has been extended. There is, behind the long counter at the back, an organised hum of activity, with the staff in their black dresses and white aprons preparing the orders that the waitresses out on the floor are delivering. The waitresses are the famous Lyons Nippies, although the name itself for the chain's waitresses will not be formally introduced until 1925. In 1908, they are simply Lyons waitresses, dressed in the standard uniform of black dresses and starched white aprons and white caps, moving with the efficient briskness that the management of the chain trains them to maintain. One of them comes to our table within a minute of our sitting down. She is perhaps 18. She has a notepad and pencil. She greets us pleasantly in the standard greeting of the chain. She asks what we will have. We order, after a consultation of the menu card, the standard Lion's breakfast. It will consist of a pot of tea, a rack of toast, a boiled egg, a dish of marmalade, and a jug of milk. The total cost is 6 halfpenny, which by Edwardian standards represents a perfectly respectable breakfast at a perfectly respectable price. The waitress writes down the order. She takes it back to the counter. She returns, in the 5 or 6 minutes that the kitchen needs, with the order arranged on a tray, and she sets the various items on our marble-top table in the efficient manner that her training has produced. We eat. The tea is hot. The toast is fresh. The egg is properly boiled. The marmalade is the standard Lion's marmalade, which is a slightly sweeter and slightly thinner version than the marmalade served at the more expensive establishments, but which is, for 6 halfpenny at 8:30 in the morning, entirely acceptable. We drink the tea, we eat the toast, we crack the egg, we spread the marmalade. The whole meal takes perhaps 20 minutes. We watch while we eat the ordinary morning life of the tea shop around us. There are perhaps 10 other customers in the room. There are 2 clerks at one table reading the morning's newspapers and discussing the business news of the day. There are 3 women at another table who are evidently preparing for a morning's shopping in the West End, and who are working their way through their breakfasts in the companionable silence of friends who have known each other long enough that conversation is not, on every occasion, required. There is a single elderly gentleman at a third table, reading the Times, with his breakfast already finished, lingering over the last of his tea. There is a group of foreign visitors at a fourth table, speaking what we can hear from where we are sitting, to be German, with their guidebook open on the table between them and their earnest discussion of what they are going to do after breakfast already underway. The room, taken altogether, is the standard cross-section of London's morning population that any Lions in the West End would be holding at this hour on a Thursday, and we are, in our quiet corner, simply one more party adding our own contribution to the picture. We finish. The waitress brings the bill. We pay her. We leave an additional 2p as a tip, which is the standard rate for adequate service, and which the waitress acknowledges with an inclination of the head. We stand up. We walk to the door. We push the door open. The bell rings. We step out, back onto the pavement. The morning, in the time we have been inside, has continued to develop. The light is brighter. The traffic is heavier. The shops, in the few minutes we have been at our breakfast, have begun to open. The day, in its unhurried way, is beginning the next part of its business, and we, having taken on the fuel that the next several hours will require, are now ready to continue. The shops, by the time we step back out onto the pavement, are mostly open. The blinds have been raised. The doors have been unlocked. The brass fittings have been polished. The window displays, which have been arranged the previous evening or in the early hours of this morning, are now ready to be admired by the steadily growing flow of pedestrians along the pavements. The shopmen and the shopgirls, in their dark clothes and their white linen at the necks and cuffs, are at their counters. The shopgirls, in particular, deserve a moment of separate description. The Edwardian shopgirl in 1908 is one of the distinctive figures of the new urban working population that the great commercial expansion of the previous generation has produced. She is, typically, between 16 and 25 years of age. She is, typically, the daughter of the lower middle class or upper working class population of London and the surrounding suburbs. She has typically completed the basic education that the late Victorian school system provided, with the handwriting and the arithmetic and the general competence that the shop work requires. She lives, in many cases, in the lodgings that the larger department stores provide on their upper floors, with the dormitories of perhaps 6 or 8 girls per room, and the rules of conduct that the establishments require their resident staff to observe. She works typically 6 days a week, with hours from about 8:30 in the morning to about 7 in the evening, and with a half-hour break for lunch that she takes at the staff dining room on the lower floor of the building. She is paid typically between 15 and 25 shillings a week, depending on her experience and the status of the shop she works in, with the additional benefit of her room and board if she is a resident. She is in the social life of the great shop, organized into the hierarchy of junior assistants and senior assistants and floor walkers and section managers, with the slow career progression that the form permits, being one of the possible routes by which an able young woman of her class might, over the years, work her way up to a position of modest dignity within the establishment. She is dressed on the shop floor in the standard uniform that her shop has prescribed, typically a long dark dress in black or dark grey, with the white linen collar and the white linen cuffs that the convention requires, with her hair pinned up under a severe arrangement that the management considers appropriate to the shop's standards. She is, in her appearance and her bearing, the visible representative of her shop, and the training she has received has emphasized the importance of her conduct as a contribution to the reputation of the establishment. The floor walkers, who are the senior officers of each shop's customer service, are at their stations near the front doors, ready to receive the customers who will, in the next hour, begin to arrive in significant numbers. We turn back onto Regent Street and continue our walk north. We have in our minds the loose plan of working our way up to Oxford Circus, then turning west along Oxford Street to look at the bigger department stores, then turning south down Bond Street, then crossing back through the Burlington Arcade, and so completing a loop that will bring us back, in due course, to the Piccadilly Circus end of the morning. The plan is loose. The plan can be modified by anything that catches our attention. The plan is, in essence, simply the shape that our morning's walking is going to take. The window of a large drapery shop on the east side of Regent Street stops us. The window has been dressed this autumn in a kind of theatrical tableau, with a group of tailors' dummies arranged as if at a country house breakfast scene, all of them dressed in the latest country tweeds and walking suits that the shop is selling for the upcoming shooting season. The dummies are arranged around a breakfast table set with real-looking china and silver and a collection of empty cups and plates, with one of the male dummies standing near an artificial fireplace and another seated at the table reading a fake newspaper, and a female dummy in a tweed walking costume standing near the window, as if about to set out for a walk in the country grounds that the shop's window has, by careful selection of background props, suggested. The whole composition is the sort of theatrical retail invention that the late Victorian and Edwardian period has been developing into a high art, with the various large drapers and outfitters competing each season to produce the most arresting tableau that their windows can hold. The window we are looking at is, by the standards of the genre, a good one. It tells a story. It establishes a scene. It sells, by means of the story and the scene, the various items of clothing that the dummies are wearing without having to make any explicit advertising claim about them at all. And there is, beside us at the window, a group of other passers-by also stopped to look. There are 2 ladies in their morning walking dresses, evidently mother and daughter, with the daughter pointing out to the mother a particular detail of one of the costumes that has caught her eye. There is a single gentleman in a frock coat and bowler hat, with an inclination of his head suggesting that he is in fact assessing the workmanship of the suits on the male dummies with a professional eye that may indicate his own tailor's interest in the competition. There is a young woman in a more modest dress, with the wistful attention of a person who would like to be able to afford the goods on display, but who knows, by the accurate self-assessment of her own circumstances, that she will not be one of the people buying them this season. The four of us stand briefly in our accidental association before the window, looking at it together with our different reasons, and then, by the unspoken signal of our individual decisions to move on, we disperse, the mother and daughter walking on north toward Oxford Circus, the gentleman walking on south toward Piccadilly, the young woman crossing the street to the other side, and ourselves continuing in our original direction. The traffic on the road, by this point, has thickened considerably. The omnibuses, in particular, are now running at the full intensity of their morning service. Most of them, in October 1908, are still horse-drawn, in the open-topped design that London has been using since the 1860s. The horse omnibus carries on its lower deck perhaps 12 passengers on two long cushioned benches that face each other along the length of the vehicle. It carries on its open-top deck perhaps another 14 passengers on two long cushioned benches that face outward with the passengers' backs to each other along the central spine of the roof. The driver sits on a high box at the front. The conductor stands on the open rear platform, holding the vertical pole that allows him to balance as the vehicle moves, and using a leather satchel and a machine that punches tickets to manage the fare-taking. The fare for a journey of any distance within central London is generally 1 penny or 2p. The conductor calls out the route as the bus approaches the stops. The conductor helps the passengers on and off, with particular care for the women in their long dresses and the elderly in their frailty, and with the experienced patience for the various awkwardnesses of getting people on and off a moving vehicle that the work has trained him to develop. There are also on the road the new motor buses, of which several different types are now in service in central London. The most numerous are the buses of the London General Omnibus Company, which has been gradually replacing its horse buses with motor buses since 1905, and which will, by 1910, have completed the conversion of its central London routes. The motor buses are louder than the horse buses. The motor buses are, in their early designs, also somewhat unreliable, with breakdowns common enough that the company keeps spare horse buses available to substitute on short notice. The motor buses are, however, faster than the horse buses, and they can carry, in their slightly larger bodies, a few more passengers per journey. The economics of the change favour the motor bus over the horse bus. The horse bus, although still numerous in October 1908, is in a slow, steady decline that will, within the next 5 years, eliminate it from the streets of central London entirely. We watch a horse omnibus pass us as we walk. The two horses, a pair of bays, are pulling steadily, with the experienced gait of working horses who have been on this route for years. The driver on his box is a man of perhaps 50, with the weathered face of a London cabby of his age, with a clay pipe in his mouth and a crumpled bowler hat on his head. The conductor on the rear platform is a younger man in his late 20s, in the dark uniform of his company. The bus is, on this run, perhaps 2/3 full, with the upper deck having more passengers than the lower, because the morning is fine, and the view from the top is one of the pleasures of riding the London bus on a clear October day. The bus moves past us at perhaps 6 miles an hour, which is the standard pace of the horse omnibus in central London traffic. The bus continues up Regent Street toward Oxford Circus. Oxford Circus, when we reach it, is the meeting point of Regent Street and Oxford Street, and it is one of the busiest junctions in the West End. The circus, unlike the more architecturally distinctive Piccadilly Circus to the south, is a relatively plain quadripartite junction, with the four corners occupied by large commercial buildings of various periods and various styles. The traffic moves through the circus in a complicated pattern that has, by 1908, started to require the assistance of a London policeman in the centre, who stands on a raised platform with white gloves on his hands and who directs the various streams of traffic by the carefully timed gestures of his arms. The policeman is, in this period, the main traffic management technology that the city possesses. The traffic lights that will, in the 1920s and 1930s, gradually replace him have not yet been invented. The policeman stands. The policeman gestures. The traffic, in its various streams, responds. We turn west into Oxford Street. Oxford Street, in October 1908, is the main department store street of London. It runs west from Oxford Circus to Marble Arch, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile, and along its length are concentrated the largest of the new mass-market department stores that have been transforming the shopping habits of the British middle class over the previous generation. The street is, at this hour, beginning to fill with the morning shoppers, who are mostly women in their morning walking costumes, with their reticules over their wrists and their lists of intended purchases in their pockets, walking in groups of 2 or 3 or alone, with the purposeful air of people who have set aside the morning for the work of shopping and who intend to use the morning to its fullest. The first of the great stores we come to, on the south side of the street, is Peter Robinson's. Peter Robinson's is one of the older Oxford Street establishments, having been founded in 1833, and by 1908 it has grown into a considerable department store, occupying most of the corner block at Oxford Circus. Its windows on this morning are dressed for the autumn season, with the central display showing the new winter coats that the shop is selling, in the variety of colours and styles that the season has produced. The window is dressed in the careful way of a department store of its standing, with each coat on its own dummy, with each dummy positioned at the angle that shows the coat to its best advantage, and with the handwritten price cards in the copper plate that the shop's window dressing department has standardised on. The prices range from about £2 for the simpler walking coats to about £8 for the more elaborate evening cloaks. The prices are, by Edwardian standards, neither cheap nor expensive. The prices are the prices of solid middle-class shopping at a respectable Oxford Street store. We walk on. The next major store, a few hundred yards further west, is Marshall and Snellgrove. Marshall and Snellgrove is a more elevated establishment than Peter Robinson's. It caters principally to the upper middle classes and the lower aristocracy. Its windows, dressed in the same autumn season, show the more expensive and more elaborate version of the same kinds of clothing that Peter Robinson's is showing, with the prices correspondingly higher. There is in the main window a single elaborate evening dress in pale gold silk, displayed on a single tall dummy with a velvet train flowing from the dummy's waist along the polished wood of the window floor, with a price card discreetly placed at the front. 35 guineas. 35 guineas in 1908 is the equivalent of perhaps 8 to 10 weeks of wages for a skilled male worker. The dress is not, in any sense, intended for the skilled male worker. The dress is intended for the lady of a country house who needs an evening dress for the private dinners of her London season, and the price is calibrated by the shop's careful management to the part of the social spectrum where dresses of this kind are bought. We continue. The next major store is Bourne and Hollingsworth, which is newer than the other two, having been founded in 1894, and which, by 1908, has begun to acquire the reputation as one of the leading department stores of the central London middle-class shopping public. Its windows are showing the same kind of autumn merchandise as the others, in a price range broadly similar to Peter Robinson's. There is a brighter, more vigorous quality to the displays, a sharper use of large painted advertising cards, and a more practical shop atmosphere when one looks through the windows into the interior. Bourne and Hollingsworth is the sort of store where the wife of a prosperous bank clerk or a successful schoolmaster would spend her morning, and the practical character of the establishment, by comparison with Marshall and Snellgrove, reflects the everyday concerns of the customers it is designed to serve. We do not, on this morning, go into any of these stores. We are walking, we are looking, we are taking in the accumulating impression of what Oxford Street in October 1908 is, without yet committing to the detailed engagement that going inside any one of the establishments would require. We are, in the recreational sense, window shopping, which is a verb that the English language has, in the last few decades of the 19th century, formally acquired in response to exactly the sort of activity that Oxford Street has been encouraging the population to engage in. There is, at this stage of the morning, no Selfridges on Oxford Street. The great American influence department store that will more than any other single establishment transform Oxford Street from a respectable shopping street into the famous international shopping destination of the 20th century, is, in October 1908, still a building site. Gordon Selfridge, the American businessman who has come to London with the intention of doing for Oxford Street what John Wanamaker and his contemporaries have done for the great American shopping streets, has bought the site, has commissioned the architect Daniel Burnham to design the building, and has, throughout the year 1908, been overseeing the construction work that will, in March 1909, open as the largest department store in the British Empire. We can see, as we pass the site, the substantial scaffolding and the partial walls of the new building, with the construction crews at their morning's work, with the foreman in his bowler hat directing the various trades, with the great delivery wagons bringing in the steel and the stone that the construction is consuming at the rate of a townscape's worth of material every week. The site is one of the largest construction projects in central London at this date. The result, in 5 months' time, will be the building that we now know as the original section of the Selfridges store on Oxford Street. We pass the site. We continue walking. We walk as far as Marble Arch, which marks the western end of Oxford Street, and we stand for a moment at the corner of Hyde Park, looking south along the eastern edge of the park toward Hyde Park Corner. Hyde Park on this October morning is partly visible through the railings, with the autumn sun catching the last of the green grass and the first of the turning leaves of the great plane trees that line the main walks. There are, even at this hour, riders on the bridle paths inside the park, gentlemen and ladies on horseback taking their morning exercise, with the accompaniment of their grooms riding at a respectful distance behind them. The morning ride in Hyde Park is, in 1908, still one of the fashionable rituals of the London season, although the season has technically ended, and the great riding crowds of the May and June Rotten Row will not appear again until next year. There is, nevertheless, a steady flow of horses and riders on the paths even at this off-season hour, and the figures of the riders, seen from the corner of the street through the railings of the park, have the picturesque quality that the English watercolour tradition has been celebrating for over a century. We turn south, walking down Park Lane. Park Lane, in 1908, is the main boundary between the open green of Hyde Park on one side and the great private mansions of the wealthiest London families on the other. The mansions on the east side of Park Lane are, In this period, some of the largest private residences in the city. There is Grosvenor House, the London residence of the Duke of Westminster. There is Dorchester House, the London residence of the Holford family. There is Aldford House, the London residence of the Wernher family. There is Brooke House, the London residence of the Castle family. There is Dudley House, with its great picture gallery. The mansions face the park, with their elaborate stone fronts and their wrought iron gates and their private gardens running between the houses and the curb. The mansions are, on this October morning, mostly quiet. Many of their owners are still on their country estates for the autumn shooting season and have not yet returned to London. The mansions stand empty, with their housekeepers and a skeleton staff of servants in residence, waiting for the families to come back in the late autumn or early winter. We walk past Grosvenor House, which is the largest of them. We walk past Dorchester House, which is, by the accident of its architectural inspiration, modelled on the Villa Farnesina in Rome. We walk past the smaller establishments between them. We arrive, after about 10 minutes of walking, at Hyde Park Corner. Hyde Park Corner, in 1908, is one of the most architecturally distinguished junctions in central London. The triangular space in the centre is dominated by the Wellington Arch, which has been on this site since the 1820s, and which has, since 1883, lost the colossal equestrian statue of the Duke of Wellington that originally stood on top of it. The statue was moved in 1883 to its current position at Aldershot, and the top of the arch has, since 1912, held the great quadriga sculpture of Peace, descending in her chariot that we now know. In October 1908, the top of the arch is empty, awaiting the new sculpture that the Commission has just been awarded for, and the arch presents itself in its temporarily denuded state, with the undignified incompleteness of any large architectural feature that has lost its central ornament. The traffic at Hyde Park Corner, however, is undiminished by the temporary absence of the sculpture above it. The junction is, like Piccadilly Circus and Oxford Circus, one of the busiest in the West End. The four streams of traffic from Park Lane, Knightsbridge, Grosvenor Place and Piccadilly meet here in a great confused swirl, with another policeman on his raised platform attempting, with the same white-gloved gestures as his colleague at Oxford Circus, to manage the resulting confusion. The success of the management is partial. The traffic moves. The traffic does not, on the whole, collide with itself. But the frictions of the various streams accommodating each other produce at this junction the sort of slow, patient movement that the London traffic of 1908 has come, in its main junctions, to require of all its participants. We turn east into Piccadilly. We are, at this point, perhaps 2 miles from where we started this morning. The morning has now reached perhaps 10:30. The shops along Piccadilly are fully open. The customers who began arriving at 10 are now joined by the second wave of customers who arrive at 10:30. And the third wave, the most fashionable, who will arrive at 11, are starting to thicken the streams of pedestrians along the pavements. We walk along the south side of Piccadilly, with Green Park now on our right rather than our left, as it was in our morning's first walk. The view across Green Park to the trees and to the distant glimpse of Buckingham Palace beyond is, in the autumn light, one of the pleasures of walking along this stretch of the street. We pass the Ritz Hotel, which has been open for 2 years, having been built between 1904 and 1906 on the site of the demolished Walsingham House Hotel. The Ritz, in October 1908, is one of the most fashionable hotels in London, run on the model of the original Ritz in Paris by the same César Ritz, who established the Paris Hotel and whose name has, in the brief period since the London Ritz opened, become a kind of synonym for the highest standards of hotel keeping that the European travelling class can secure. The hotel's restaurant is famous. The hotel's tea room is famous. The hotel's bar is famous. The whole establishment is, in its 2 years of existence, already one of the fixed reference points of fashionable London life, and the front entrance of the hotel as we pass it is being attended by 2 liveried doormen in long coats and top hats, who are, at this moment, handing a lady out of a brougham that has just drawn up at the curb. We continue past the Ritz. We continue past the great front of the Royal Academy at Burlington House, with the public courtyard in front of it, and the group of visitors who have come for the morning's openings of the various exhibitions that the Academy is in this season hosting. We continue past Albany, which is the famous private residential complex set back from Piccadilly behind its iron gates and its porter's lodge, with its own private courtyard and the set of apartments that have been for over a century the London residences of various distinguished bachelors and families of the literary and political class. We continue past Hatchard's, with its windows full of the new books of the autumn season, and Fortnum and Mason, which we noted in the morning, and which we will return to later in the day. We arrive, in due course, at the corner of Burlington Arcade. The arcade is, in 1908, one of the institutions of London shopping life that has been continuing, more or less unchanged, since its construction in 1819. It's a covered shopping arcade running north from Piccadilly to Burlington Gardens, perhaps 200 yards long, with specialist shops along both sides, and a set of beadles in their distinctive uniforms, patrolling the central walkway to maintain the dignified atmosphere that the management has, since the original construction, been determined to preserve. The beadles, in their navy frock coats and their gold-braided top hats, are an important part of the arcade's character. They were originally introduced by the arcade's first management to deter the criminal element that had been a feature of the surrounding streets in the immediate post-Napoleonic period. They have, since their introduction, evolved into a more decorative and more symbolic feature of the arcade, although they retain, even in 1908, the formal authority to remove from the premises any person whose behaviour they consider unsuitable to the standards of the establishment. The standards, in their detailed published form, prohibit, among other things, running, whistling, singing, the carrying of large parcels, and the use of perambulators. The standards have been published since the original opening. The standards have not, in the intervening 89 years, been significantly relaxed. We turn into the arcade. We walk slowly along the central walkway with the specialist shops on either side. There is a jeweller with a window of antique silver and enamel snuff boxes. There is a print seller with a window of carefully framed 19th century engravings and the handwritten cards giving the title and date of each print. There is a leather goods shop with a window of leather wallets and leather cigarette cases and leather visiting card cases in the various colours that fashionable gentlemen of the period prefer. There is an antiquarian bookseller with a window of leather-bound editions of the classic English authors. There is a glove maker with a window of pale kid gloves arranged in pairs across a velvet display. The shops are, in their individual character, all distinctive. The shops are, in their collective effect, a kind of museum of the specialist trades of the London West End at the height of its Edwardian prosperity. The arcade is, in 1908, at the peak of its prosperity. It has not yet, at this date, been bombed in the wars to come. It has not yet, at this date, been altered by the various 20th century renovations that subsequent generations will perform on it. It is in its essential form the arcade as its original Regency designer intended it to be, and the slow walk that we are now performing along its central walkway is the slow walk that visitors have been performing along this same walkway for the previous 90 years. The arcade, in its enclosed atmosphere, has its own particular acoustic character. The sounds of the busy Piccadilly outside, which were the dominant sounds of our walking 5 minutes ago, are now reduced to a muffled, distant background hum. The sounds inside the arcade are the immediate sounds of the people walking on the polished stone floor, the clicks of the heels on the smooth surface, the soft conversation of the groups of shoppers, the distant call of one of the beadles in the central walkway, speaking to a colleague at the far end. The atmosphere is hushed. The atmosphere is, by the careful management of the place, deliberately hushed. The shops, on either side, are not, on the whole, advertising aggressively. The customers, on the whole, are not bargaining or even discussing prices in any visible way. The whole experience of the arcade is the experience of a calm interlude in the middle of the noisier London morning, and the visitors who come into it, having paid no admission fee, but having submitted, by the simple act of entering, to the unwritten code of the place, are, for the duration of their walk, members of the temporary community that the arcade has been holding for over 80 years. We come out of the north end of the arcade, into Burlington Gardens. We turn east, walking past the distinguished facades of the buildings on the south side of the street, and we arrive, after a few minutes, at the corner of Old Bond Street. We turn right and begin to walk south down Bond Street, back toward Piccadilly, in the loop that our morning's walking has described. Bond Street, in 1908, is the most expensive shopping street in the British Empire, and very probably one of the 2 or 3 most expensive shopping streets in the world. It runs in a slight curve from Oxford Street to Piccadilly, with the northern half called New Bond Street and the southern half called Old Bond Street, and along its length are concentrated the leading jewellers, art dealers, couturiers, and antique dealers of the London trade. The shops on Bond Street are, on the whole, smaller than the shops on Oxford Street and Regent Street. The shops on Bond Street do not, on the whole, advertise. The shops on Bond Street rely, for their custom, on the private knowledge of their existing clientele, and on the word-of-mouth reputation that the private knowledge has, over generations, established. A great deal of the most expensive money spent in London on a daily basis is spent in the shops along this street, and the shops, by their understated frontages and their carefully restrained window displays, give very little public indication of just how much that daily expenditure actually amounts to. The first major establishment we pass, on our right, is Asprey's, the silversmiths and jewellers. Asprey's has been on Bond Street since 1847. It occupies a substantial frontage with several windows, each of which is dressed with the carefully selected items that the shop's window dressing department considers to be the representative samples of what is available inside. The windows show, this morning, a selection of the silver dressing table items that the shop is famous for. Silver hairbrushes with the customer's monogram engraved on the back, silver hand mirrors, silver scent bottles, silver pin cushions. There are, in the windows beyond, the selection of jewellery, a single diamond brooch on a pale blue cushion, a single pearl necklace on a pale grey cushion, a single emerald pendant on a pale white cushion. The displays are, in their visual effect, almost Spartan. The displays do not crowd the windows. The displays trust the customer to recognize that the individual items on the cushions are the sort of items that, in their actual price and their actual quality, do not require the kind of dense visual presentation that more ordinary establishments employ. We do not go in. We walk on. The next establishment is a smaller jeweller, then a milliner of considerable reputation, then a French dressmaker who has on his painted sign above the door only the discreet legend of his own name and the word couturier. The flower sellers we have been passing all morning at the various street corners of the West End deserve, by the traditional importance of their trade in the visual life of the city, a separate attention. They are, on the whole, women, although there are some men in the trade as well. They are, on the whole, in the lower stratum of the working population of London. They have, in many cases, walked into central London from their lodgings in the East End or in the South Bank districts, carrying their baskets of flowers from the flower market at Covent Garden, where they have bought the day's supply at the wholesale prices that the morning market provides. They sell throughout the day at the fixed corners that the trade has been working for generations, the individual buttonholes for the gentlemen and the individual posies for the ladies and the bunches of violets that the sentimental customer occasionally requires. They earn on a good day perhaps 2 or 3 shillings, which after the cost of the morning's flowers leaves them perhaps 18 pence or 2 shillings of profit. On a bad day they earn less. On a wet day, when the flowers wilt and the customers do not stop, they earn very little at all. They are, in their daily struggle, one of the visible reminders that the visible prosperity of the West End streets does not extend, on the whole, to all of the people who work on them. They sit on this October morning on their low stools at their fixed corners, with their baskets in front of them, with the bunches of late chrysanthemums and the bunches of imported roses and the bunches of violets arranged in the careful display that the trade requires. The customers who buy from them throughout the day are mostly the regular customers who have been buying from the same seller at the same corner for years, and who exchange with her, when they buy, the ritualized greetings of a regular commercial relationship. We pass several of them. We do not, on this morning, buy. We continue our walking. There is, beyond him, an art dealer with a window of 2 paintings, a landscape in the manner of Corot, and a portrait in the manner of Raeburn. There are, beyond him, the antique dealers, with their windows of carefully chosen pieces in the various periods that the trade currently considers fashionable. A single Sheraton chair in one window, a single Chinese export porcelain vase in another, a single French commode in a third. The shops continue on both sides of the street in the same understated manner, with the individual variations that distinguish one specialism from another, but with the same general principle of restrained display and carefully cultivated atmosphere. The customers on Bond Street on this October morning are mostly of a particular kind. They are women, on the whole. They are women of the upper middle class and the upper class. They are dressed in the morning costumes that their stations in life require, long dark walking dresses, fitted jackets, fashionable hats with feathers, gloves of the appropriate material and colour for the season. They walk in pairs or in groups, with their friends or with their married daughters or with the ladies' maids who have accompanied them out for the morning's expedition. They speak to each other, when they speak, in the low tones that their general habits encourage. They do not, in the audible fragments we catch as we pass, discuss prices or money in any way. They discuss the goods on display in the windows. They discuss social engagements they have coming up. They discuss the acquaintances they have in common. They are, in their pleasant, unhurried walking, the main commercial constituency of the street, and the street, in its careful presentation of itself, is calibrated to their tastes and their expectations and their levels of expenditure. There are also, in smaller numbers, men. The men on Bond Street at this hour are mostly of two kinds. There are the husbands and fathers and brothers of the women, accompanying them on the morning shopping in the dutiful role that the male relatives of well-off women have been playing on shopping streets for centuries. There are also, in smaller numbers, the men who are themselves the customers, on their own accounts, of certain particular establishments. The cigar merchant, the antique dealer, the art gallery, the bespoke gunmaker. There is indeed a gunmaker on Bond Street, whose window we pass. A single shotgun in a polished case lined with green baize, with the gun's engraved silver fittings catching the light from the window in the way that fine engraving does. The shotgun is the kind of item that the country gentleman has come up to London specifically to order, with his list of personal preferences for the engraving and the stock and the individual measurements of his arm and his shoulder that the bespoke gun-making process requires. The shotgun, when it is finally finished and delivered to him in 8 or 10 months' time, will cost him perhaps £80, which represents a considerable expenditure, although for a country gentleman of his rank, not an extraordinary one. We continue walking. We are now in the slow descending course of our walk down Bond Street, perhaps halfway between Oxford Street and Piccadilly. The morning is now well advanced. The sun is high. The traffic on the road, in the parts of it where the cross streets meet Bond Street, is heavy. The pavements are full. The shop windows are busy with the flow of looking. The air is the air of the West End at the peak of its working day, with all the various sounds and smells and visual textures of the place at their fullest intensity. We pass, at this point, a particular jeweller's window that catches our attention more than the others have. The window is dressed on this morning with a single object, an open velvet case, lined in a soft blue silk containing a single ring. The ring is a gold ring with a single pale blue stone of perhaps 2 carats. The stone, by its colour and its visible quality, is a sapphire of considerable distinction. There is no price card. There is, on the wooden shelf next to the case, a handwritten card with only 2 words on it, by appointment. The whole window, taken altogether, is an example of the most extreme version of the Bond Street style of presentation, with the entire window real estate of the shop given over to a single object that does not, by its placement of the words by appointment, even invite the casual passer-by to step inside. The shop, in its private way, is essentially a private club for the customers it has already chosen to deal with. The window, in its severe restraint, is communicating exactly that fact to the world. We stand briefly looking at the window. We are not, of course, in the market for a sapphire ring of perhaps 2 carats. We are simply looking, in the recreational sense that the word window shopping covers. The ring is beautiful. The window is, in its severe way, also beautiful. We move on after a moment in the quiet acknowledgement that the theatre of Bond Street has, as careful understatement, achieved precisely the effect on us that it intends to achieve on every passer-by who happens to glance into one of its windows. There is, on the pavement just ahead of us as we walk on, a passing figure who illustrates, in her individual person, the constituency at which Bond Street is principally aimed. She is a lady of perhaps 35, walking alone in a dark walking dress of considerable elegance, with a fitted jacket in the same dark wool, and a fashionable hat with a single curving feather in pale grey. Her gloves are pearl-kid, her boots are soft grey leather, her reticule is silver grey silk with small silver fittings. The whole of her costume, in its careful coordination of tones, has clearly been the result of considerable thought, and the thought, by every visible indication, has been informed by the detailed knowledge of what the fashionable taste of October 1908 currently considers correct. She walks slowly, with the unhurried pace of a lady who has the whole morning available for her shopping. She stops briefly at a window we have just passed, looks at something in it, moves on. She nods as she passes another lady on the pavement, in the slight movement of recognition that suggests the two are members of the same circle without being particularly close. She does not, at any point, give any visible indication that she is aware of being observed by anyone. She is the representative figure of the Bond Street customer at her confident peak, well-dressed, well-mannered, well-funded, in her native habitat. We pass her as our paces gradually diverge after a few moments. We do not see her again. We arrive, in due course, at the southern end of Bond Street, where it meets Piccadilly. We have completed, in this morning's walking, the loop that we set out to do. We have walked from Jermyn Street up Regent Street to Oxford Circus, west along Oxford Street to Marble Arch, south down Park Lane to Hyde Park Corner, east along Piccadilly to Burlington Arcade, north through the Arcade to Burlington Gardens, east to Bond Street, and south down Bond Street to where we now are. The walking, with the intervals at the windows and the breakfast at the Lions, has taken us about 3 hours. It is now approaching 11:30. We are, at this point, beginning to think about lunch. The London middle classes of 1908 take their main midday meal between 12:30 and 1:30, in a window that the working life of the city has settled into over the previous generation. The wealthier classes take it slightly later, around 1:30, in keeping with the general slower rhythm that their lives permit. The very wealthy who are still on their country estates at this season do not take it in London at all. We have, before we need to be at lunch, perhaps an hour to fill, and we decide, in the unhurried way of our morning's progress, to fill it by walking down through St. James's to the Mall and then along the Mall to Trafalgar Square, with the loose plan of finding our lunch somewhere in the Strand area. We turn south, off Piccadilly, into St. James's Street. St. James's Street is, in 1908, the main street of the gentlemen's clubs of London. Along its length are concentrated some of the most exclusive private clubs in the British Empire: White's, Brooks's, Boodle's, the Carlton. The clubs are, in their architectural presentation, mostly housed in dignified but understated Georgian and early Victorian buildings, with their painted names above the doors and their porters in livery in the entrance halls. The clubs are on, this October morning, beginning their morning's activity. Members are arriving for breakfast or for the reading of the morning newspapers in the club libraries, walking up the front steps and being greeted by the porters who know each member by sight and who have, by long professional practice, internalized the set of personal preferences that the most demanding of the members have come to expect. We do not, of course, go into any of the clubs. We are not members. The clubs of St. James's Street in 1908 are among the most carefully guarded private spaces in London, with their membership lists, vetted by their committees with the severity that the clubs consider necessary to maintain the standards of their establishments. We walk past the clubs, looking at their dignified facades, with the respectful attention that the buildings invite from any informed pedestrian. At the bottom of St. James's Street we arrive at St. James's Palace. which is the most senior of the working royal palaces of London, although by 1908 it is no longer the main residence of the sovereign. King Edward, in this period, divides his time between Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and the various country houses of the wealthy friends he visits in the autumn shooting season. St. James's Palace is used in this period for the ceremonial functions that its status still requires of it, the formal reception of foreign ambassadors, the court ceremonies that have been held here for centuries, the residences of certain senior members of the royal family who are not currently in residence at Buckingham Palace. The palace, in its red brick Tudor exterior, is one of the distinctive landmarks of London, with the gatehouse in particular, with its octagonal corner turrets, being a feature that any visitor to the city has, by this date, come to associate with the most ancient form of the London royal presence. We walk past the palace, we turn left into the Mall, and begin to walk east toward Trafalgar Square. The Mall, in 1908, is the broad ceremonial avenue that runs between Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square, lined with great plane trees and bordered on the south side by the open green of St. James's Park, and on the north side by the dignified buildings that house various government and royal household offices. The Mall, on this morning, is mostly quiet. It is not, in October, the season of any particular royal ceremony, and the great processional uses to which it is put on the major royal occasions of the year are, at this date, on holiday. The main traffic on the avenue is the steady flow of private carriages, and the occasional motor car making its way between the West End and Westminster, with the accompaniment of pedestrians walking along the broad pavements on either side. We walk along the south pavement with St. James's Park on our right. The park, on this October morning, is full of the autumn beauties that any London park presents at this season. The great plane trees with their leaves just beginning to turn, the lake in the centre with its surface reflecting the autumn sky, the various waterfowl on the lake about their morning's activities, the flower beds along the paths with the last of the autumn flowers in them. There are, in the park at this hour, perhaps 50 or 60 walkers, nursemaids with perambulators, elderly couples taking their morning constitutional, groups of children with their attendants, the occasional businessman taking the detour through the park on the way from a club appointment to a morning's work in an office somewhere. The park, in its busy autumn way, is one of the pleasures of central London at this season, and we walk past it with the partial attention of pedestrians who have, in our intended programme for the day, decided that we will, later in the afternoon, return to walk through it more carefully. We arrive, after about 10 minutes, at the eastern end of the Mall, which opens through the great archway of Admiralty Arch into Trafalgar Square. Admiralty Arch in 1908 is brand new. It has been completed only in the previous year, having been built between 1904 and 1907 as part of the Great Queen Victoria Memorial Scheme that has, in the years since the Queen's death, been transforming the area between Buckingham Palace and Trafalgar Square into the formal ceremonial route that we now know. The arch is a substantial classical structure, with 3 main arches that the main road traffic uses and 2 smaller side arches for pedestrians. Above the arches are the offices of the Admiralty, which has historically had its headquarters in this area. We walk through the central pedestrian arch, with the echoing acoustics that the stone tunnel produces, and we emerge into Trafalgar Square. Trafalgar Square is in 1908 one of the most famous public spaces in the world. It is the main civic square of London, dominated by Nelson's column at its centre, with the 4 bronze lions at the base of the column added in 1867, and the various other statues and fountains and architectural features arranged around the central space in the elaborate Victorian composition that has been completed over the previous half-century. The National Gallery occupies the entire north side of the square. The Church of St. Martin in the Fields stands at the northeast corner. Various government buildings and clubs and hotels border the other sides. The square is, on this October morning, full of the ordinary activity of any London public space. Tourists, pedestrians on their way somewhere else, groups of office workers crossing the square between meetings, the flocks of pigeons that the square has been famous for as long as anyone can remember, the barrels of seed that the square's regular feeders are dispensing to the pigeons in the accumulated ritual of the place. We do not, on this morning, linger in the square. We have been walking for several hours. We are now, by our internal clocks, ready for our main meal of the day. We turn east along the Strand, toward the main restaurant district of the period, with the loose intention of finding our way to Simpson's in the Strand, which is one of the most famous of the London chop houses, and which, on a Thursday at noon, will be one of the leading lunch destinations of the West End business class. Simpson's in the Strand, in 1908, has been on its present site for nearly 80 years. The establishment was founded in 1828 as a chess and coffee house, and it acquired over the following decades its present character as one of the leading traditional English restaurants in central London. It is famous, above all else, for the roasting of its great sides of beef, which are wheeled out from the kitchens on the famous silver-domed trolleys, and carved at the table by the senior carvers in the theatrical performance that the restaurant has, since the mid-19th century, made the centrepiece of its signature lunch service. We arrive at the front door at about 10 minutes to 12. The doorman in his dark coat receives us with the formal greeting that the establishment requires. We are shown into the great main dining room, which is one of the most distinctive interiors in the West End. The room is large, with high ceilings and the dark wood panelling that 19th century restaurant designers favoured for establishments of this kind. The walls are hung with the carefully framed engravings and prints that have been accumulating in the establishment over its long history. The tables are, in the main arrangement of the room, set in long rows running parallel to the walls, with the intermediate gaps for the waiters and the trolleys to move between them. The tablecloths are white, the cutlery is heavy, the glasses are heavy. The plates are the individual plates of the establishment's own pattern, with the printed name of the restaurant on the rim. The whole atmosphere of the place is the atmosphere of a Victorian institutional dining room that has, by the careful conservation of its character over the previous 50 years, remained the same kind of room it always was. We are shown to a table for two near one of the windows. We are given, by the head waiter, the printed menu of the day. The menu is brief by the standards of more elaborate establishments. The main courses are the famous saddle of mutton, the famous sirloin of beef, the roast lamb, and a selection of the alternative dishes that the kitchen also prepares on a daily basis. There are, before the main courses, the soups and the fish dishes that the establishment provides for the customers who want a more elaborate meal. There are, after the main courses, the puddings of the English tradition, the apple tart, the rice pudding, the suet pudding with treacle, the selection of cheeses with the biscuits. There are, throughout the meal, the accompaniments of the various wines and beers that the establishment sellers on its premises. The wine list is good, by Edwardian standards. The beer list is, more particularly, good, with the various ales and stouts of the major English breweries available in considerable variety. We order. We choose, after a consultation between us, the sirloin of beef, which the waiter takes our order for, with a nod that he reserves for orders he considers correct. We order, before the beef, a clear soup, and after the beef, the apple tart with cream. We order, with the meal, a bottle of one of the better Burgundies, which is an extravagance on a weekday lunch, but which, in the spirit of our holiday, we permit ourselves. The first course arrives quickly. The clear soup is the standard hot clear consommé that the establishment has been serving for decades, with the fine vermicelli noodles in it and the fragments of clear chicken meat. It is hot. It is well seasoned. It is, in its simple way, exactly what the standard English lunch of 1908 expects to begin with. We eat it slowly, with the attention to the craftsmanship that the lunch deserves. The main course, when it comes with the theatrical performance that the establishment is famous for. The great silver-domed trolley is wheeled to our table by the senior carver, in his white apron and his white cap. The dome is lifted. Inside is the great sirloin, perhaps 15 pounds in weight, on its hot silver platter, with the dark juices around it, and the steam still rising from its surface. The carver, with the swift competence of a man who has been doing this for 30 years, slices 3 or 4 thin slices from the joint with the long thin carving knife, lays them on the hot plates that his assistant has presented him with, and then, with an additional ladle, distributes a portion of the dark juices over each plate. The plates are placed in front of us. The trolley is wheeled away to the next table. The whole performance has taken perhaps 90 seconds. We eat. The beef is, by every standard the lunchtime customer of the establishment is entitled to apply, excellent. It is rare in the centre. It is brown on the edges. It has the mineral richness of the Scottish beef that the establishment buys from the same supplier it has been buying from for the previous several decades. It is accompanied on a separate plate by a portion of the famous horseradish sauce that the establishment makes in its own kitchens, by a portion of the Yorkshire pudding that the restaurant has, on the principle of consistency, kept on its menu in the same form for 50 years, and by a portion of the boiled vegetables that the season permits. The whole plate is, as a representation of the English tradition of lunchtime cooking, very nearly perfect. We eat it slowly. We do not, on the whole, talk while we eat. The food is the kind of food that requires a certain amount of focused attention, and the focused attention, given the quality of the food, is willingly supplied. The wine is also good. The Burgundy is a pomade from a respected shipper, of a vintage that the cellarmaster has chosen with care for the customers of the day. It is rich, it is well structured, it complements the beef in the way that good Burgundy complements good beef, with the mutual amplification of qualities that the partnership of food and wine, when it works, produces. We drink slowly. We refill our glasses in the intervals between mouthfuls of beef, with the careful attention that the wine, as well as the food, deserves. The pudding comes when the main course is finished. The apple tart is the establishment's standard apple tart, with the carefully crimped pastry edge and the dusting of caster sugar across the top of the apples. The cream is the jug of double cream that the establishment serves with all its hot puddings. We pour the cream over the tart. We eat the tart. The apples are tart, and the pastry is buttery, and the cream is rich, and the combination, like the combination of beef and Burgundy that preceded it, is the kind of simple culinary perfection that the English lunchtime tradition, when it is in good hands, can reliably produce. We finish the tart. We finish the cream. We finish the wine, in 2 final glasses each. We linger for some time over the concluding cup of coffee. The coffee at Simpson's is, by Edwardian standards, ordinary. The traditional English lunchtime culture has not, in 1908, quite caught up with the coffee culture of the continent, and the cups of black coffee that the waiter brings to us are pleasant rather than remarkable. We drink them slowly. We watch, while we drink, the ordinary continuing life of the dining room around us. The room is now, at 1:30, full to capacity. The carving trolleys are circulating between the tables. The wine waiters are pouring. The conversation, in the room as a whole, is the steady hum of 50 or 60 separate conversations going on simultaneously, with the accumulated effect of a mid-priced restaurant at the peak of its lunchtime service. We pay the bill. The bill comes to perhaps 15 shillings, including the wine and the additional coffee, which by Edwardian standards represents a substantial but not extravagant lunch for two. We leave a tip of 2 shillings for the waiter, which is the standard rate that the establishment's regular customers leave. The waiter accepts the tip with the inclination of the head that we have seen several times today from the various staff in the establishments we have used. We stand up. We collect our hats and coats from the cloakroom near the entrance. We step back out, after a moment, onto the Strand. The Strand, when we emerge, is in the intense bright light of a clear London afternoon. The sun, which has been climbing through the morning, is now near its zenith for the day. Although in October at this latitude, its zenith is not very high above the horizon, and the light has the angled quality that any northern autumn afternoon produces, the Strand in the early afternoon is in its full working busyness. The pavements are crowded. The road is full of vehicles. The shops along the street are open. The whole texture of the place is the texture of central London at the peak of its working day. We turn west, walking back toward Trafalgar Square. We have in our internal afternoon's plan the loose intention of spending the next hour or two in a more leisurely walking, taking in some of the parks and one or two of the smaller museums, and gradually working our way back by tea time to one of the great tea rooms of the West End for the ceremonial intermission that the English afternoon tea provides between lunch and dinner. We arrive again at Trafalgar Square. We pause for a moment at the front of the National Gallery. We consider whether to go in. The National Gallery in 1908 is one of the leading art collections in the world, and its rooms are open to the public free of charge throughout the year, in the generous tradition that the British state has in its institutional funding of the arts, established over the previous half-century. We could, easily, spend the rest of the afternoon inside the building, looking at the selection of pictures that we particularly want to see, and the gallery would be open to us for as long as we wanted to stay. We decide, however, against it. The afternoon is too fine to spend indoors. The walking is too much the main pleasure of our day for us to interrupt it. We turn away from the gallery and continue our walk west, back along the Mall, with Trafalgar Square behind us, and the great avenue of plane trees stretching ahead of us toward Buckingham Palace in the distance. The Mall, in the afternoon, is slightly busier than it was in the morning. There are more carriages. There are more pedestrians. The sun has reached the position in the sky where it is now slanting down the length of the avenue from the southwest, with the autumn light catching the leaves of the plane trees and the individual figures of the walkers in the kind of long-shadowed afternoon clarity that any northern autumn produces. The walking is pleasant. The walking is, in fact, very nearly the most pleasant walking of the day so far. We are, with the fuel of our lunch in our bodies and the leisurely afternoon ahead of us, in the state of contentment that a good lunch in a good restaurant in a familiar city on a fine autumn day reliably produces. We turn off the Mall, after a distance, into St. James's Park. Public in the afternoon is the main afternoon walking park of the West End. It has, more than the larger Hyde Park, the intimate character that the afternoon walk requires. Its lake, which runs through the centre of the park in a slightly curving narrow shape, is the main feature, with the bridge across it about halfway along its length giving access from the north side to the south side. The lake is famous in 1908 as it has been for a century and as it remains today for its waterfowl. There are mallards and tufted ducks and water hens and the particular collection of pelicans that the park has been keeping since the 17th century, when the original pelicans were given by the Russian ambassador to King Charles II. The current pelicans are the descendants of those original birds, with various refreshments of the line over the intervening centuries from various other gifts and acquisitions. They sit, on this October afternoon, on the pelican rock that has been provided for them on an island in the lake, with the heraldic dignity that pelicans always seem to possess in such settings. We walk slowly along the path on the south side of the lake. There are perhaps 30 or 40 other walkers in this section of the park at this hour. There are nursemaids with their charges, the children in their elaborate autumn coats with the velvet collars and the leather gloves and the soft leather boots, walking with the careful concentration of well-dressed children, whose mothers have given them strict instructions about not getting their clothes dirty. There are elderly couples taking the slow afternoon constitutional that their doctors have prescribed for the maintenance of their health. There are parties of office workers from the nearby government buildings on Whitehall taking the 15-minute lunch break that their working day permits and using the break to walk in the park rather than to eat. There are groups of foreign visitors with their guidebooks open, working through the list of London attractions that their organised tours have included on their itineraries. The park, in its mixed afternoon clientele, is the representative cross-section of the population that uses central London on a Thursday afternoon in October, and we, walking slowly along the path with the unhurried interest of leisured visitors, fit easily into the picture. We stop, at one point, by a bench near the bridge. We sit down for a few minutes. We watch the ducks on the water. The ducks on the lake are in the steady busy mode of waterfowl, who are aware that the regular afternoon feeders have begun to arrive with their bags of breadcrumbs, and the ducks are converging, in the predictable way of birds in a public park, on the points along the bank where the feeders are most reliably going to set up. There is, on the path opposite us, an elderly woman with a canvas bag of bread, who is now distributing the bread, in portions, to the flock of ducks that has accumulated at her feet. The ducks are competing, in the good-natured way of ducks, for the individual portions. The elderly woman is, by the expression on her face, deriving from the distribution of the bread the same kind of steady satisfaction that elderly people in city parks have in every era derived from the daily ceremony of feeding the local birds. The ducks, the woman, the bag of bread, the autumn afternoon, these are the ordinary elements of the park's afternoon life, and the elements assemble themselves in the unhurried way that any park assembles itself into the picture that we are watching from our bench. We sit for perhaps 10 minutes. The October sun, on this side of the lake, is full on us. The bench is warm under the sun. The breeze that has been blowing all morning has dropped almost completely. The whole of the immediate area, in the conditions of this particular afternoon, has acquired the still warm quality that the very best autumn afternoons in London produce, the kind of afternoon that the people who live in the city remember individually, even decades later, as the afternoons that captured something essential about what the place can be when its weather and its light and its population of birds and walkers and eccentric old women feeding ducks all combine in the right way. There is on the path opposite us as we sit an additional figure who deserves a mention. He is an elderly gentleman in a long dark overcoat and a bowler hat, with a walking stick in his hand, and a posy of late autumn flowers tucked into the buttonhole of his coat. He is walking slowly with the unhurried pace of a man who has nothing to do for the rest of the afternoon, and who has, for the previous 40 years, been walking in this same park at this same hour on the same kind of October afternoon. He stops occasionally to look at the ducks. He stops occasionally to lean on his stick and to watch the distant figures of the children playing on the open lawn beyond the lake. He has in his bearing the composed dignity of an elderly Londoner who has, by long habit, made the park his daily living room, and who knows by the long accumulation of his daily walks every bench and every tree and every pelican by the individual character that long acquaintance has given them. He passes us, at one point, on the path. He inclines his head, in the formal way of his generation, in our direction. We incline our heads in return. He continues his slow walk. He disappears in due course around the bend in the path, in the unhurried way that has characterized all of his movements since we first noticed him. There are, on the open lawn beyond the lake, a group of children playing. They are perhaps 6 or 7 of them, between the ages of 4 and 10, with their attendant nursemaids in the dark uniforms of their profession sitting on a bench at a respectful distance, watching them. The children are playing some variant of the games that English children of their class have been playing in this same park for generations. A game of tag, a game of throwing a ball back and forth, a game involving a hoop. They are dressed in the elaborate clothing that the period considered appropriate for upper-middle-class children. The boys in sailor suits with the white piping along the collars, the girls in white dresses with the dark sashes around the waist, and the white stockings and the black patent leather shoes. They run, they laugh, they shriek occasionally with the high pitch that children produce when at full play. The nursemaids on their bench watch them with the steady attention that the work requires, with the intermittent calls of correction when one of the children does something the social code prohibits. The whole of the scene, in its autumn afternoon perfection, is the kind of scene that the painters of Edwardian park life have, in the previous decade, been recording, with the picturesque qualities that the genre requires. He is one of the 1,000 or so figures we have seen today, of all of whom we will, in the future of our subsequent days, retain only the partial memory. But he is, in his unhurried dignity on this particular afternoon, one of the representative figures of the city, and the city, in his representative person, is the city we have come to visit. We get up, eventually. We continue walking west along the path toward the Buckingham Palace end of the park. We cross the bridge midway along the lake and look down at the water below us, with a darker reflection of the bridge cutting across the bright reflection of the sky on the surface. We pause on the bridge for a moment. We look east, back along the lake, with the National Gallery and the spire of St. Martin in the fields visible in the distance through the trees. We look west, with the distant glimpse of Buckingham Palace at the far end of the avenue. We continue our walk. We come out at the western end of the park, near the front of Buckingham Palace. The palace in 1908 has not yet acquired the familiar Aston Webb east front that will be completed a few years later. The facade, in this period, still belongs to the older 19th century arrangement, now partly obscured by alteration work between 1907 and 1913. The Victoria Memorial in front of the palace is in the late stages of its construction. The whole of the area is, in this autumn afternoon, in the middle of one of its periodic phases of architectural transformation, with scaffolding visible on parts of the palace front and the construction works on the memorial proceeding under the steady supervision of the architects and engineers who are managing the project. We do not, on this afternoon, linger at the palace. The palace, like St. James's Palace, is not in this period the main residence of the king on most days, although the king is in fact in residence at this date, and the flag above the central pediment is flying to indicate it. We walk past the front of the palace, past the construction works, and we continue west along Constitution Hill, which is the road that runs along the southern edge of Green Park toward Hyde Park Corner. Constitution Hill, on this autumn afternoon, is one of the most pleasant walking routes in central London. It is a broad road, with substantial pavements on both sides, lined with great trees, with Green Park on the north side, and the stone wall of Buckingham Palace Gardens on the south side. There are very few pedestrians on it at this hour, in comparison with the more crowded streets of the West End. There is the occasional carriage moving slowly along the road. There is the occasional pair of riders in the bridle paths that run along the inside of the park railings. The whole of the road has the quiet character of a country lane within the heart of the city, and the contrast between this quiet stretch and the busier streets we have been walking on for the rest of the day is one of the pleasures that an afternoon's London walking, properly conducted, can produce. We walk slowly along Constitution Hill, with Green Park on our right, and the wall of the Palace Gardens on our left. The trees in Green Park are mostly bare of any flowering at this season, but the leaves are at the height of their autumn turning, with the great planes and the great chestnuts in their full rich colours of yellow and amber and brown. The sun, slanting through the leaves, is producing the dappled patterns on the pavement and the road that any parkside walking on a fine autumn afternoon produces. We walk slowly. We have by this point no particular destination beyond the loose intention of arriving back in the West End in time for tea. We arrive, after about 20 minutes of unhurried walking, at Hyde Park Corner, where we were earlier in the morning. The afternoon traffic at the junction is now somewhat heavier than it was in the morning. The streams of vehicles from the various directions are at their full afternoon intensity. The policeman on his raised platform is at his patient work. We watch, briefly, the slow swirl of the traffic around the central island. We then turn east, walking back along Piccadilly, in the same direction we walked in our morning's first walk, but now with the different quality that the afternoon light gives to everything we have already seen. We are now thinking about tea. The English afternoon tea in 1908 is a ceremony of considerable elaboration, served between 4 and 5:30 in most respectable establishments, with the set sequence of sandwiches, scones and cakes that the convention has, over the previous half-century, established. The main tea rooms of the West End include the great hotels, the specialist tea rooms attached to certain shops, and the genteel establishments that have been set up specifically for the purpose. We have in our mental list of options the choice between the tea room at the Ritz, the tea room at Fortnum and Mason, the Buzzards tea room on Oxford Street, the chain of Fuller's tea shops, and the rather grander tea ceremonies at the Savoy and at Brown's Hotel. We choose, on this afternoon, Fortnum's, because we noted the shop in the morning and have been meaning to go in. Fortnum and Mason, on Piccadilly, is a shop unlike any other in London. It has been on its present site since 1707, having been founded by a footman in the household of Queen Anne, who began, with his colleague Mr. Mason, the grocery business that has, over 2 centuries, grown into one of the most distinctive establishments in the British retail world. The shop, by 1908, is famous for its supplies of carefully chosen teas, its preserves and condiments, its biscuits and cakes, its wines and spirits, and the elaborate hampers that it makes up for the customers who want to take a substantial picnic to one of the country events of the season. It is also famous, since the extension of its premises in the previous decade, for its tea room, which occupies a section of the upper floor of the building, and which serves in the standard form the set tea that the convention requires. We arrive at the front door of Fortnum's at about 4:15. Before we go in, however, we pause for a moment outside the door, looking at the windows. The windows of Fortnum's, in 1908, are dressed in the style that the establishment has developed over its long history. The windows are not in the manner of the more aggressive Oxford Street establishments, full of merchandise crowded together to attract the eye. The windows are instead, in their careful arrangement, almost like the windows of an art gallery, with the individual products presented as objects of individual contemplation. There is in one of the windows a single tall jar of preserved ginger on a velvet plinth, with a handwritten card identifying the variety. There is in another window a selection of the establishment's famous tea blends in their distinctive labelled tins, arranged in a careful pyramid. There is in another a single elaborate hamper, partially open, with a selection of the contents visible: a bottle of champagne, a jar of caviar, a tin of biscuits, a jar of the establishment's own marmalade. The hampers, in 1908, are one of the leading famous products of the establishment. They are made up by the order of customers for various purposes: for the picnics at Henley and Ascot and the other fashionable summer events, for the Christmas presents to country relatives, for the expeditions to far-off places that British travellers of the time are, in considerable numbers, undertaking. The most famous of all the Fortnum's hampers in this period are the expedition hampers that have, in the previous decade, been supplied to the various polar expeditions that have been setting out from London for the Arctic and the Antarctic. The image of a Fortnum's hamper sitting in a canvas tent on an ice floe, surrounded by bearded explorers in heavy fur clothing, is one of the features of the establishment's reputation in the adventurous strand of the British public mind, and the careful presentation of the contemporary hamper in the autumn window is in its implicit way an evocation of that adventurous reputation. The doorman in his green livery receives us with the formal greeting. We are shown by an attendant up the stairs to the tea room on the first floor. The tea room is in its decoration the carefully restrained luxury that the establishment has, over its long history, made its signature. The walls are pale green. The tables are round tables with white tablecloths. The chairs are Louis Quinze-style chairs with pale gold frames and green silk cushions. The lighting is electric, in crystal pendant fittings hanging from the high ceiling. The whole of the room has the atmosphere of a high-quality establishment that has, in its design and in its service, the easy confidence of a place that does not, on the whole, need to try very hard to convince its customers that they are in the right kind of room for what they have come to do. We are shown to a table near one of the windows. The window looks out, at this height, over Piccadilly, with the autumn afternoon light coming in through the lace curtains and giving the whole table a pale golden glow that has, in its visual effect, very nearly the quality of a Vermeer painting. The waiter, in his dark suit and his white linen napkin folded over his arm, brings us the printed menu of the afternoon tea. The afternoon tea at Fortnum's, by the conventions of the place, comes in two main varieties, the standard tea and the more elaborate high tea that includes an additional course of cold meats and savoury dishes. We choose, on this occasion, the standard tea, which is sufficient to our needs. We choose, from the list of available teas, the establishment's house Darjeeling, which is one of the blends that the shop has been making up in its own tea blending department for some decades. The tea arrives in due course on a silver tray. The tray contains a silver teapot of the establishment's own pattern, with the tea already brewing inside, a silver hot water pot for the customer's use in adjusting the strength of subsequent cups, a silver milk jug, a silver sugar bowl with the sugar tongs, 2 fine bone china teacups with their saucers, and the silver tea strainer that the proper service requires. The tray is placed on our table. The waiter pours the first cups, with the careful attention to the ceremony that the service involves. The tea in our cups is the pale amber of properly brewed Darjeeling, with the fragrance of the leaves rising in the steam from the cup. The food arrives, after an interval, on a 3-tiered cake stand. The bottom tier contains the selection of finger sandwiches, thin slices of bread, with the crusts cut off, filled with cucumber, with smoked salmon, with egg and cress, and with thinly sliced ham and mustard. The middle tier contains the fresh scones, still warm from the kitchen, with the individual pots of clotted cream and strawberry jam beside them on the tier. The top tier contains the selection of cakes, a Victoria sponge, a slice of fruit cake, 2 chocolate eclairs, 2 millefeuilles, and a selection of biscuits. The whole stand is, in its visual effect, one of the pleasures of the English afternoon tea, and the careful arrangement of the dishes on the 3 tiers is the ritual that the establishment has, over the years, refined to its present state. We eat. We start, by convention, with the sandwiches. The sandwiches are perfect by the standards of the form. The bread is fresh. The fillings are well prepared. The cucumber sandwiches in particular, which are the most traditional of the form, are delicate in the way that good cucumber sandwiches always are, with the thin slices of cucumber laid in a single layer between the bread and the thin film of butter holding everything in place. We work through the sandwiches slowly, with the sips of tea between them. The conversation during the eating is the unhurried conversation of 2 people who have been walking together for several hours and who do not, at this point in the afternoon, particularly need to fill the intervals between the quiet enjoyments of the meal. We move, after the sandwiches, to the scones. The scones are warm. They are tender. They have, by the standard of the establishment, exactly the consistency that a properly made scone should have, with the crisp outer surface and the soft interior crumb. We split them. We spread them with cream and jam. The old debate about whether the cream should go on first or the jam should go on first is, in this establishment, settled in the Cornish manner, with the jam on first and the cream on top, although the establishment's customer base contains, of course, a minority of Devon-bred individuals who reverse the order on principle. We do not, on this occasion, enter the debate. We simply eat the scones in whichever order seems most natural. We move, after the scones, to the cakes. We work slowly through the selection on the top tier. The Victoria sponge is the standard establishment Victoria sponge, with the layer of jam and the dusting of icing sugar on top. The chocolate eclairs are filled with whipped cream and topped with the thick chocolate icing that the establishment has been making in its own kitchens for decades. The millefeuilles are fresh, with the layers of pastry still crisp. The fruitcake is rich. The biscuits are the selection of the establishment's own ginger biscuits and shortbread. We do not, in the end, eat all of the cakes. The whole stand, taken altogether, is more than 2 people can comfortably consume, and the portions left at the end will be, by the establishment's standard practice, removed by the waiter without any comment or any attempt to encourage us to finish them. We continue after the eating with the refilling of our teacups from the silver pot. The tea, by the convention of the form, is supposed to last as long as the customer wishes to remain in the room. The waiter, who has been observing us from a distance, will refresh the pot with hot water as often as required, without any additional charge. We sit, after the food is finished, with our refilled cups, looking out of the window at the slowly changing light on Piccadilly outside. The autumn afternoon, while we have been at our tea, has begun to acquire the reddish quality that the late afternoon of a clear October day produces. The shadows on the pavement outside are now much longer than they were when we sat down. The light on the buildings opposite has acquired the warm gold tint of the late autumn sun. The day, in its unhurried way, is beginning to think about its own ending. We sit for some time. We are, by this point, in the comfortable state that the combination of a good lunch, a long walk, and a substantial afternoon tea reliably produces in the human body. The chairs at our table are comfortable, the light is beautiful. The sounds of the room around us, the quiet conversations of the other customers, the quiet movement of the waiters, the quiet clink of china and silver, are the soothing background to the comfortable stillness of our own table. We could, easily, sit here for another hour. We are, in fact, sitting here for the next 40 minutes, doing very little beyond watching the slow change of the light outside and refilling our cups occasionally with the hot water from the silver pot. At about 10 minutes to 6, we ask for the bill. The bill, for the standard tea for 2, with a pot of the house Darjeeling, comes to 5 shillings and 6pence. We pay it. We leave the additional shilling as a tip for the waiter. We stand up. We collect our coats from the attendant in the foyer outside the tea room. We walk down the stairs, back to the ground floor of the shop, and out after a moment, through the front door onto Piccadilly. The light, when we step out onto the street, has changed considerably from when we went in. The sun, although it has not yet set, is now low enough that its direct rays are reaching only the upper stories of the buildings, with the lower portions of the street already in the shadowed twilight of the early evening. The lamps along Piccadilly have not yet been lit, but the lamplighters, who are responsible for the gas lamps in this section of the city, are already at work, moving from lamp to lamp with their long-handled poles, and lighting the wicks one at a time. We can see one of them, a few hundred yards east of where we are standing, working his way along the south side of the street, with the chain of newly lit lamps stretching back behind him toward Piccadilly Circus, and the chain of yet unlit lamps stretching ahead of him toward Hyde Park Corner. The lamplighter is one of the distinctive figures of the London evening of 1908. The conversion of the city's street lighting from gas to electricity, which has been proceeding gradually since the late 1870s, is now well advanced in some districts, and considerably less advanced in others. The main commercial streets of the West End have, by this date, been mostly converted to electricity, with the electric arc lamps now providing the main lighting. But there remain, in many streets, and certainly in many residential districts, substantial sections of the city still lit by gas, with the daily ritual of the lamplighter still part of the rhythm of the evening. The lamplighter goes out at the calculated moment of the late afternoon, when the natural light has fallen below the threshold at which the artificial light is required, and he moves, by the efficient route that his round of lamps prescribes, from one to the next, with the lifting of the pole to the mechanism in the lamp's collar, and the flare of the gas as the wick catches, and the steady glow of the lamp as he moves on to the next one. The lamps he leaves behind him, as he moves on along the pavement, settle, after their initial flare, into the steady yellow glow that gas lamps produce, and the chain of these glows along the south side of Piccadilly is, in the dimming light of the late afternoon, the quiet visual signature of the turn from day to evening. We watch briefly the slow progress of the lamplighter ahead of us. The lamps he has lit are now glowing along the south side of the street with the soft yellow light that gas lamps produce, distinctively different from the whiter light of the electric lamps that have begun to take over from them. The combination, on a street like Piccadilly that has both kinds of lamp, is the mixed visual texture that the late Edwardian London evening particularly possesses, with the older gas light and the newer electric light producing, between them, the composite illumination that the street will have for the rest of the evening. We turn west, walking slowly along the south pavement of Piccadilly in the dimming light of the early evening, with the lamps along our route now almost all lit, and the shops along the street just beginning the transitions of their windows into the evening displays that they will have until they close. The afternoon, in the unhurried way that has characterized the whole of our day, is now moving toward its close, and the evening, with all of its different attractions and rhythms, is beginning, by the steady fall of the light, to take over from it. We return by the slow walking pace that the day has taught us to the hotel on Jermyn Street. The walking back takes about half an hour. The light in this period fades quite rapidly. By the time we reach the hotel, the gas lamps along the side streets are all lit, and the electric lamps along the main commercial streets are providing their whiter alternative illumination. The shop windows are in their evening glow, with the additional electric lighting that many of them now use to make their displays visible to the after-work crowd of pedestrians who have begun to fill the pavements. We arrive at the hotel. The porter at the door receives us with the respectful nod. We go up to our rooms. We have, in the Edwardian convention, a rest of perhaps an hour before we need to begin dressing for dinner. In 1908, evening dress is a more elaborate undertaking than the modern reader. Accustomed to the dressing conventions of a later period, may immediately recognize both gentlemen and ladies in the social class that takes its evening meal in any kind of public establishment are expected to dress in the formal evening clothes that the convention has established. The gentleman wears in the standard form the dress suit consisting of a black tailcoat, white waistcoat, white shirt with starched front and wing collar, white bow tie, black trousers, black silk stockings, black patent leather shoes, and accessories including a white handkerchief in the breast pocket, and a pair of pearl shirt studs. The whole costume, when properly assembled, requires the assistance of a valet for the details of the shirt front, and the cuffs, and the placement of the studs. The lady, in the standard form, wears a long evening dress of silk or satin in one of the fashionable colours of the season, with the elaborate corsetry that produces the distinctive S-shape of the Edwardian female silhouette, with long evening gloves of pale kid leather extending above the elbow, with dancing slippers of a colour matched to the dress, with an evening wrap or fur stole around the shoulders, and with the elaborate evening hairstyle that her maid has spent the previous half hour creating. The whole costume, like the gentleman's, requires the assistance of a maid for the details that the wearer cannot, on her own, manage. We take our allotted hour. The assistance is provided. We are, in due course, dressed in the full evening costume that the Edwardian conventions require. We come down to the lobby of the hotel at about 7:15. We have, by our advance arrangement, a reservation at one of the leading hotel grill rooms for 7:30, and we have arranged with the porter for a hansom cab to be waiting at the door. The hansom cab, when we step out of the hotel door, is at the curb. The driver, perched up high on his box behind the cab, touches his hat to us. The horse, in the lamplit street, is one of the standard hansom cab horses of central London, a compact bay horse, well groomed, with the alert posture of a working animal who has been on this rank for several hours and who is ready to move when the driver gives the signal. The cab itself is the two-wheeled enclosed vehicle that the design has settled into over the previous 50 years, with the folding glass front that can be raised in cold weather and the open front that can be left down in fine weather. We choose, on this October evening, to leave the front partly open, and we climb into the cab and settle ourselves on the leather-cushioned bench inside. The driver leans down through the trap in the roof above us. He asks where we are going. We tell him. The Carlton Hotel. On Pall Mall. He touches his hat. He closes the trap. He gives the flick of the reins that the horse has been waiting for. The horse moves off at a steady trot. The cab moves smoothly into the evening traffic of Jermyn Street. The hansom cab, in 1908, is in the late phase of its long history as the main means of light personal transport in central London. The design was patented by the architect Joseph Hansom in 1834, and over the subsequent 74 years the two-wheeled cab has become one of the most recognisable features of the London streetscape. The cabs are managed by a complex system of cab ranks throughout the city, with each rank having its assigned position on a particular street and the cabs arriving and departing in the sequence that the ranks regulations prescribe. The drivers are, by the custom of the trade, almost a separate social class within the working population of the city, with their own dialect and their own knowledge of the streets and the buildings and the inside information about which fares are good and which are bad. They are, in the popular literature of the day, often portrayed as comic Cockney figures, although the actual practitioners of the trade are, on the whole, rather more various and more dignified than the literary stereotype suggests. The hansom cab is, however, in this period, beginning to be displaced by the new motor taxis. The first motor taxis began to appear on the streets of London in 1903. By 1907, when the new electric meter that gave the taxis their name was introduced, there were perhaps 1,000 of them on the streets. By 1908, when we are now in our leisurely cab journey across the West End, there are several thousand. The motor taxi is, by the standards of the form, faster than the hansom cab, more weather protected for the passenger, and less dependent on the individual welfare of a working horse. The motor taxi is also, however, noisier, more prone to the mechanical breakdowns that are characteristic of any vehicle of this early period, and considerably less aesthetically distinguished than the elegant hansom cab. The choice between hansom and motor taxi is, in October 1908, a real choice, and many passengers, including ourselves on this particular evening, prefer the old-fashioned conveyance for the character that the new alternative does not yet possess. We ride along Jermyn Street. The hooves of the horse, on the road surface, produce the steady clopping that has been one of the leading acoustic signatures of the London street for centuries. The wheels of the cab, on the road, produce the steady rolling sound that the iron-rimmed wheels make on the dressed stone surface of the West End streets. The driver, on his box behind us, is silent, with only the occasional click of his tongue to the horse to communicate his instructions. The cab moves steadily along the street, past the lit shop fronts and the lit hotel doors and the groups of pedestrians on the pavements who are, like us, on their way to their evening's engagements. We turn from Jermyn Street into St. James's Street, then south to Pall Mall. Pall Mall, in the early evening, is the main axis of London clubland, with the great clubs along it now in their full evening occupation. We pass the Reform Club, with its great windows lit, and the Travellers' Club next door, and the Athenaeum at the corner. We arrive, after about 10 minutes of riding, at the entrance of the Carlton Hotel. The Carlton Hotel, in 1908, is one of the most fashionable hotels in London. It was opened in 1899 on Haymarket at the corner of Pall Mall, in the elaborate French Renaissance style that the architect Charles Muse favoured for his hotel commissions. It is, in this period, the chief rival to the slightly newer Ritz on Piccadilly, and the two hotels are, in the hierarchy of the West End, competing for the same constituency of fashionable evening diners. The Carlton's Grill Room, under the management of the great chef Auguste Escoffier, is one of the most celebrated restaurants in London. Escoffier, who came to the Carlton with his colleague Cesar Ritz in 1899, has been responsible, over the decade of his work in London, for establishing the set of culinary conventions that the modern hotel restaurant has, in the years since, taken as its model. He is, in the senior commercial culinary class of London, the most distinguished single practitioner of his art, and the kitchens at the Carlton, on a Thursday evening in October, are at the peak of their steady operation. The whole arrangement, by the evidence of the surrounding commercial activity, was both extraordinarily successful and extraordinarily competitive. The other leading hotel restaurants of the West End had, in the same period, been developing their own claims to culinary distinction. The Savoy, on the Strand, where Escoffier and Ritz had originally worked before moving to the Carlton in 1899, had taken on a new chef and was, in 1908, still one of the leading rivals to the Carlton in the competition for fashionable evening custom. The Ritz, on Piccadilly, where Ritz himself was now in residence, was the most recent entrant in the competition, and was building, in its 2 years of operation, the reputation that would, over the next several decades, give its name to the superlative form of luxury. The Café Royal, on Regent Street, was an older establishment of a different character, with a bohemian clientele and a distinctive culinary tradition, and was, in 1908, at the height of its cultural fame. The Trocadero, just off Piccadilly Circus, was a more popular establishment, with a broader clientele and a less expensive set of menus. The choices for the fashionable evening diner in the West End of 1908 were taken altogether considerable, and the choice between them was, on any given evening, a careful negotiation between the individual parties' tastes and budgets and social considerations. We climb out of the hansom cab. The doorman in his elaborate livery receives us. We pay the cab driver his fare, which is 2 shillings and an additional 6pence as a tip, and the driver, who has been, on the evidence of our interaction, a perfectly competent and perfectly courteous member of his trade, touches his hat to us, gives the click of his tongue to his horse, and moves off down the street to find his next fare. He is, by our brief acquaintance, a man of perhaps 55. He has, on the evidence of his accent, been driving a hansom in central London for at least 30 years. He has, by the evidence of the leather binding around the corners of his cab, and the careful polish of the brass fittings, taken proper care of his vehicle in the daily way that the trade requires, he has, by the evidence of his interaction with his horse, the easy mutual understanding of a working partnership that has been together for some years. The details that we have noticed in our 10-minute ride across the West End are the details that any thoughtful observer of his trade would notice in the 10-minute interaction with any particular hansom driver, and the thoughtful observation, when it is performed in the leisurely spirit that our holiday has encouraged, is one of the pleasures that London at this period continues to provide. We lose sight of him after a moment as he turns the corner at the end of Pall Mall. We do not, on the whole, expect to see him again. He continues, in the unrecorded continuity of his working evening, on his further rounds with the further customers in the further streets of his city. We are shown by the doorman through the entrance hall to the main foyer of the hotel. The foyer of the Carlton, in the early evening, is one of the most elegant interior spaces in London. It is decorated in the elaborate Louis Quinze style that the period considered appropriate for the public rooms of the most expensive hotels. The walls are panelled in pale gold-painted boiserie. The ceiling is plastered with the elaborate decorative work that the style requires. The lighting is by means of a great central crystal chandelier with the additional sconces around the walls. The carpet is a deep red aubusson, with the elaborate pattern that the French weavers had been producing for the great houses of Europe for over a century. The furniture in the foyer consists of Louis Quinze's sofas and chairs in the same style as the panelling, with the upholstered cushions in pale silk. The whole atmosphere of the place is, by the careful design of the hotel, the atmosphere of a private French chateau drawing-room transferred, with the adjustments that public function requires, to the centre of London. The foyer, at this hour, is occupied by perhaps 20 other people. There are, on the various sofas, the pre-dinner gatherings of the parties who are about to go in to dinner, the gentlemen in their black tail-coats and the ladies in their evening dresses. There is by one of the tables a group of 3 Americans by their accents, evidently a married couple and the wife's father, looking at a printed menu that one of the hotel staff has provided for them. There is by another of the tables a French diplomatic party, conversing in low rapid French. There is by one of the leading sofas a group of English aristocrats with the confident, easy manner that the private mutual recognition of their class produces. The whole of the assembly is the representative international cross-section of the kind of people who dined at the Carlton on a Thursday evening in October 1908, and we, in our respectable evening clothes and our genteel demeanour, fit into the picture without producing any noticeable disturbance in it. Ina. We are met after a few moments by the maître d'hôtel, who has the printed list of the evening's reservations on his lectern near the entrance to the dining room. He confirms our reservation. He inclines his head in the formal manner that the establishment's protocols require. He shows us through the adjacent doorway into the dining room itself. The dining room of the Carlton, on this October evening, is at the peak of its theatrical operation. The room is large, perhaps 100 feet long and 40 wide, with the same elaborate Louis Quinze decoration as the foyer, but with the additional theatrical features that a great public Edwardian dining room required. The ceiling is painted with the allegorical scenes that the style favoured. The walls are hung with great mirrors in elaborate, gilded frames. The chandeliers are larger than the one in the foyer, and there are several of them, hung at regular intervals along the central axis of the room. The tables, perhaps 40 of them, are arranged in the careful pattern that the room's geometry permits. with the more important tables along the walls under the great mirrors, and the less important tables in the central rows. The tablecloths are white, the cutlery is silver, the glassware is fine cut crystal. The flowers on each table, in the silver vases, are fresh chrysanthemums and roses that the hotel's florist has been arranging this afternoon. The whole effect is, by every standard the period establishes, magnificent. We are shown to a table for two, near one of the great windows that look out over the lit garden of the hotel. The table is set for the elaborate dinner that the establishment serves, with the multiple forks and knives and spoons that the various courses will require, with the multiple wine glasses for the succession of wines that the meal will involve, with the individual butter dishes and the individual rolls of bread already in place. We sit down. The chairs are comfortable. The view from the table is, in its main feature, the lit garden outside the window, with a fountain in the centre that has been illuminated by electric lights in its base. The dinner, by the customs of the establishment, will be a long one. The waiter brings us the printed menu of the evening. The menu is elaborate by any standard. It runs, in the French of the establishment's culinary tradition, to perhaps a dozen courses, if the customer chooses to take all of them, although the contemporary convention permits the customer to select only the courses that he or she particularly wants to take. We consult between us on what we will have. We choose, after a discussion, a meal of moderate elaboration, the clear consommé to begin, followed by a fillet of sole in the establishment's standard Veronique preparation, followed by a lamb cutlet with the accompaniment of vegetables, followed by a portion of the establishment's famous peach melba, which Escoffier originally created in this hotel for the singer Nellie Melba in the 1890s, and which has, in the years since, become one of the permanent features of the Carlton's menu. We choose, with the meal, a bottle of champagne to begin, and a bottle of claret to follow with the lamb. The waiter takes the order. He returns the menu. He retreats with the efficient quietness that the establishment's training has produced. The meal proceeds over the next 2 hours in the careful succession of courses that the establishment has perfected. The consommé is hot and clear and well seasoned. The sole is delicate, and the grapes in the Veronique sauce are sweet against the richness of the cream. The lamb is rare and the accompanying vegetables are perfectly cooked. The peach melba, when it comes, is the classic combination of vanilla ice cream and poached peaches and the thread of raspberry coulis that has, since the dish's invention, been the signature element of the original. The wines are, throughout, well chosen and well served. The conversation throughout the meal is the unhurried conversation of two people enjoying a good meal in a beautiful room, and the intervals between the courses, during which we look around the room and observe the ongoing life of the various other tables, are part of the theatrical pleasure of the dinner. The room is, throughout the meal, in its full operation. There is, at one point in the evening, the entrance of a famous opera singer who has come to the hotel for supper after her performance at Covent Garden, and whose entrance produces the flutter of attention that her presence always produces in the rooms she enters. There is, at another point, the entrance of a senior politician with his wife, who is being shown to a reserved table in one of the corners. There is, throughout, the steady passage of the various waiters between the kitchen and the dining floor, with the practiced coordination of movement that the room requires. The whole of the dinner, taken altogether, is one of the elaborate evening performances that London's Edwardian hotel restaurants regularly produced, and we, as guests in the room, are part of the cast for the evening. Whether we particularly understand ourselves that way or not, we finish at last with the cup of black coffee and the glass of cognac that the convention permits. The hour by the clock above the entrance to the dining room is now approaching 9:30. We have, in our loose plan for the evening, no further engagement, although we have considered, in the course of the meal, the possibility of going on to one of the theatres for the second half of an evening's performance. The convention of the late Edwardian theatre is for the main performance to begin at 8, with the interval at about 9, and the conclusion at about 11. It is now, by the time we have paid our bill and collected our coats, very nearly 10, and the second half of any of the major West End shows would be just beginning. We decide, after a consultation between us, to go. There are, on this October Thursday evening in 1908, perhaps 30 theatres operating in the West End. The main venues are concentrated along Shaftesbury Avenue, the Strand, the Haymarket and the adjoining streets. The shows being performed in this season include a new play by Henry Arthur Jones at the Garrick, a new musical comedy at Daly's, a revival of one of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas at the Savoy, a straight drama at the Haymarket, and the various shows at the music halls including the Tivoli on the Strand, the Empire on Leicester Square, and the Alhambra also on Leicester Square. The choice between them is broad. We choose on this evening the Music Hall, which is the popular evening Edwardian entertainment, and which, in the form of the established large halls of the West End, presents an evening of variety acts that any visitor to Edwardian London really ought, at least once, to experience. We walk from the Carlton the short distance to the Empire Theatre on Leicester Square. The walk takes perhaps 10 minutes. The streets, at this hour, are full of the evening traffic of the West End, the carriages and motor cars taking the dinner crowd from their restaurants to their theatres, the pedestrian crowd of the cheaper seat theatre goers walking between the venues, the flower sellers on the corners, the newsboys with the late evening editions, the steady passage of the buses and the trams along the main streets. The lamps, by this point, are all lit. The shop windows are in their full evening glow. The theatres themselves, with their electric signs above the entrances and their canopies extending out over the pavements, are the main points of light along the streets, and the queues of people at the entrances are visible from a distance as the dark masses against the bright fronts of the buildings. We arrive at the Empire. The Empire is, in 1908, one of the most famous music halls in the world. It opened in 1884, and over the previous quarter century, it has acquired the reputation as the leading middle-class music hall of London, with the understanding among its regular customers that the establishment will provide an evening of variety entertainment of the highest professional standard, with the additional understanding that the entertainment will not, on the whole, be quite as rough as the lower-priced halls in the East End or in the working districts of South London. The building itself is a substantial Victorian palace of entertainment, with elaborate decoration on its exterior and even more elaborate decoration on its interior. There is a great curved auditorium, perhaps 2,000 seats, with multiple tiers of boxes and balconies, with a substantial promenade behind the dress circle, and with a stage at the front that has been, over the previous decades, the platform for some of the most famous performers of the British music hall tradition. The doorman at the entrance receives us. We have, by the advance booking that we did at the hotel before dinner, 2 seats in the dress circle. We are shown to our seats by an usher in a uniform. The seats are in the 3rd row of the dress circle, with a good view of the stage. The auditorium at this point is mostly full. The interval has just ended. The audience is settling back into its seats for the second half of the evening's programme. The orchestra in the pit below the stage is just beginning the introductory music for the next act. The music hall programme in the standard form of 1908 consists of perhaps a dozen or 15 separate acts, each of about 10 or 15 minutes duration, presented in succession over the course of an evening of about 3 hours. The acts are diverse. They include singers, comic monologists, dancers, acrobats, conjurers, ventriloquists, performing animals, one-act plays, and the succession of other variety entertainments that the form has developed over its long history. The order of the acts is, by the careful management of the hall, calibrated to keep the audience continuously engaged, with the variation between different kinds of act preventing the fatigue that would set in if all the acts were of the same kind. The whole evening, in its careful programming, is the result of considerable management expertise, and the Edwardian music halls have been, over their long history, the training ground for many of the most famous British performers of the late Victorian and Edwardian theatre. The act in progress when we settle into our seats is a comic singer, a man of perhaps 50 in a loud check suit, performing a comic song about the difficulties of married life that has, by the evidence of the audience's reaction, been a popular favourite for some seasons. The audience laughs at the chorus. The audience joins in, on the second repetition, with the chorus itself. The whole hall, perhaps 2,000 voices, sings the refrain together, in the communal way that the music hall audience traditionally engages with its favoured performers. The singer, on the stage, conducts them with his stick. He smiles. He winks at the audience and goes into the next verse. The act after the comic singer is a juggler, who comes on with 3 clubs and proceeds, over the course of his 10-minute act, to add additional clubs and additional balls and additional plates to his juggling routine, until he is, in the climactic moment of the act, juggling perhaps 10 different objects of various sizes simultaneously, the dropping of each object into an assistant's hands at the conclusion of the act being timed for the dramatic effect that the form requires. The audience applauds. The act after the juggler is a magician, with a set of card tricks and sleight-of-hand pieces that he performs with the running patter of comic explanation that the form has, since the early 19th century, made part of its standard presentation. He is good. The audience appreciates him. He is followed by a singing act, then by a dancing act involving 4 young women in theatrical costumes, then by a comic monologue on the trials of suburban life that the audience receives with the recognition of people who have, in many cases, themselves been suburbanized and who recognize the details of the satire from their own daily experience. The empire itself, as a building, deserves a moment of separate description. It was designed by the architect Thomas Verity and opened, in its present form, in 1884. The auditorium in which we are now sitting is one of the most elaborate theatre interiors in London. The decoration is in the French Second Empire style that the architect favoured, with pale gold and cream as the dominant colours, with the panels of allegorical paintings between the various tiers, with the heavy plaster ornament around the proscenium, and with the great central dome above the auditorium, painted with an allegorical scene of music and dancing. The seats are upholstered in a deep red velvet. The boxes, on either side of the stage, are draped with the heavy red curtains that the contemporary convention required. The whole of the visual atmosphere of the room is the atmosphere of a palace of entertainment that the late Victorian and Edwardian period considered appropriate to the dignity of the form, and the comparison of the room to the more austere and more functional theatres of later periods is, in its implicit way, one of the lessons that any historical visit to a building of this kind teaches. There is, in addition to the auditorium, the famous promenade of the Empire, which runs around the back of the dress circle, and which, in the social history of the establishment, has had its reputation as one of the leading points of evening assembly for a section of the late Victorian and Edwardian male population. The promenade was, in the puritanical campaigns of the 1890s, briefly closed by the London County Council on the grounds that it had, in its social functions, become a place of disreputable resort. It was, after public protest, reopened, with the partition that the council required removed in due course. By 1908, the social character of the promenade has, by the natural changes of fashion, evolved into a more respectable form, although the folk memory of its earlier reputation still hangs about it in the mythology of the establishment. The main act of the second half, by the convention of the form, is the headlining performer who is the advertised attraction of the evening. The headliner, on this particular evening, is a comic actress who is famous, in the West End music hall world, for her impersonation of the various stock characters of the London streets. She comes on in a costume that suggests a Cockney flower seller, with a basket of artificial flowers on her arm, and she proceeds, over the course of perhaps 15 minutes, to perform the sketch that she has been touring with for the previous season. The sketch is, in its general outline, a comic monologue, with the Cockney character interacting with the audience in the manner that the form has perfected. She is funny. She is, in her way, a brilliant performer. The audience adores her. The applause at the end of her act is, by the standards of the evening, the loudest of the evening so far. The programme continues for another 40 minutes after her act, with the succession of smaller acts that complete the bill. The whole evening, by the time the concluding number is performed and the final orchestral piece signals the end of the show, has lasted perhaps 3.5 hours, with the additional intervals of which we have only seen the second. We stand up with the rest of the audience when the lights come on. We collect our coats from the attendant in the foyer. We make our way out, with the slow flow of the departing audience, through the doors of the theatre and onto the pavement of Leicester Square outside. The streets, when we step out, are in the state that the late evening of a West End theatre night produces. The pavements are full of the departing audiences from the various theatres, all of them in their evening clothes, all of them in the good mood that a successful evening's entertainment produces. The traffic on the road is heavy with the carriages and motor cars and hansom cabs that have come to collect their parties. The touts and the flower sellers and the newspaper boys are working the flow of pedestrians with the intensity of vendors who know that this hour, between 11 and midnight, is one of the leading commercial windows of their daily round. We walk slowly through the crowd, eastward across Leicester Square toward the adjoining streets. We have, in our loose evening's plan, the intention of walking back to our hotel rather than taking another cab, although the walking of perhaps 20 minutes through the late evening streets is an undertaking that we will reconsider if our reserves of energy turn out to be inadequate. We turn from Leicester Square into the streets of Soho. Soho, in 1908, is a foreign quarter of central London, with a substantial population of French and Italian and Eastern European immigrants who have, over the previous half-century, made the district one of the leading cosmopolitan zones of the city. The streets are narrower than the main commercial streets of the West End. The buildings are older. The commercial life of the district, even at this late hour, is still going on. There are French restaurants and Italian cafes and foreign bakeries and foreign delicatessens, all of them with their lit windows and their late evening customers. The smells on the streets are different from the smells of the West End. There is the scent of garlic and herbs from the Italian places, the scent of bread from the bakeries, the scent of coffee from the cafes that are still serving their customers at the zinc-top tables that line the walls. We walk slowly through Soho. The streets are quiet by the standards of the main commercial streets, but they are not deserted. There are groups of late diners going home. There are groups of waiters and cooks just finishing their shifts and walking to their lodgings. There are late evening pedestrians of the kind that London's foreign quarter has always attracted. The whole atmosphere of the district is, by the accumulation of its details, distinctly different from the atmosphere of the main English quarters of the West End, and the difference is one of the pleasures of walking through Soho on a late evening in 1908. We come out, after a few minutes, onto Regent Street, near Piccadilly Circus. The circus, at this hour, is in its late evening glow. The shops are closed. The traffic is still heavy with the late evening returning theatre crowds. The electric advertising signs that have begun, in the previous 2 or 3 years, to appear on the upper stories of the buildings around the circus are lit with the flashing lights and the moving messages that the new electric signage permits. The circus is, in this late phase of its day, one of the most distinctive public spaces in the world, and the crowd of late evening pedestrians who are passing through it on their various ways home is the representative cross-section of the West End's late evening population that the place collects every night at this hour. We turn from Piccadilly Circus into the length of Piccadilly that runs west, with the direction towards St. James's that will take us back to Jermyn Street and to our hotel. We walk along the north pavement in the now familiar rhythm of our day's walking, with the lit shops on our left and the dark trees of Green Park on our right across the road. The traffic, at this hour, has thinned considerably from its evening peak. The theatre crowds have mostly dispersed. The pavements are now, on this particular stretch, almost empty. We turn, after a distance, off Piccadilly into St. James's Street, and from there into Jermyn Street, where our hotel is. We arrive, in due course, at the front door. The porter, who has been on duty since the morning, is still there. He receives us. He opens the door for us. We step inside, into the lit lobby of the hotel. The day, in the slow, careful walking that has constituted it, is now done. The hour, by the clock above the reception desk, is approaching midnight. The staff of the hotel are at their night shift work, with the senior porter at his desk and the night manager going over the accounts of the day's business in his office behind the desk. The lobby, at this hour, is quiet, with only the ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of the porter's newspaper to break the silence. We collect our keys. We climb the stairs to our rooms. We let ourselves into our rooms, which have been, in our absence, prepared for the night by the chambermaids, who have come in to turn down the beds and to draw the curtains and to lay out the water carafes and the water glasses on the bedside tables. We undress. We perform the evening preparations that the ending of the day requires. We get into bed. The bed, in the comfortable hotel of October 1908, is a good bed. The sheets are crisp, freshly changed this morning. The blankets are heavy. The pillow is firm. The electric lamp on the bedside table, which we will extinguish in a moment, has the steady glow of the new electric light that the hotel has installed throughout its rooms in the modernization of the previous decade. We can hear, very faintly, Through the windows that face Jermyn Street, the distant sound of the city's continuing late life, the occasional clop of a hansom horse, the distant rumble of a carriage, the far-off voice of a man calling to another, the steady note of the city's wind through its narrow streets and around its low rooftops. We have, in the slow, careful unfolding of the day, walked from morning to deep night, through one particular part of one particular city in one particular year. We have eaten our breakfast in a tea shop, and our lunch in a chop house, and our tea in a grocer's tea room, and our dinner in a hotel grill. We have walked Jermyn Street and Regent Street and Oxford Street and Park Lane and Piccadilly and Bond Street and Constitution Hill and the Mall and the Strand and Pall Mall and Soho. We have looked at the windows of the silk shops and the shirt makers and the booksellers and the jewellers and the antique dealers and the picture galleries. We have ridden in a hansom cab. We have watched a music hall performance. We have stood at the corner of Piccadilly Circus in the morning and again in the late evening with the different qualities of light that the two visits produced. We have, by the accumulation of all of these ordinary details, taken into ourselves a partial picture of what one ordinary day in this particular city, at this particular moment, was like. This is, of course, only one day. There were many other ordinary days in this same city, in this same year. There were the days of the working population, the clerks getting up at 6 in their suburban houses, riding the early trains into the city, working their 10-hour days at the high desks of the banks and the insurance offices, riding the evening trains home again to their suburban suppers. There were the days of the servant class, the housemaids rising at 5:30 in the unheated attics of the great houses, the sequence of daily tasks that the upstairs households required, the late evenings of the downstairs gatherings in the servants' halls. There were the days of the working poor, the dockers and the factory workers and the street traders and the flower sellers, whose daily struggles to make their daily ends meet were the substantial substrate on which the visible prosperity of the West End that we have been walking through depended. There were the days of the great country families when they came up to London for their London seasons. There were the days of the bohemian writers and artists in their lodgings in Bloomsbury and Chelsea. There were the days of the foreign visitors and the commercial travellers and the peculiar private eccentrics of every kind who made up the actual population of the city in any one of its hours. We have seen only one of these days. We have seen, even of this one day, only the part of it that a leisured visitor in the West End would see. We have not seen the East End. We have not seen the docks. We have not seen the grim factories of the South Bank or the grim slums of the North. We have not seen the kitchens of the great hotels we have eaten in, nor the back rooms of the great shops we have looked at, nor the workshops of the specialist trades whose finished products we have admired in their narrow windows. We have, in our leisured walking, seen only the visible upper crust of one ordinary autumn day, in one ordinary working week of one ordinary year, in the long history of this particular city. But that is, in some respects, what we came for. We came to walk. We came to look. We came to see, in the unhurried way that an evening of this kind permits, the surface texture of a particular place at a particular moment, with the modest understanding that the surface texture, although not the whole story, is a real part of the whole story, and that the surface texture, when carefully observed, can give us a limited but real sense of what the place was, in the day-to-day life of its usual streets, in the lives of the people who walked its pavements and ate in its restaurants and rode in its cabs and watched its theatres, and looked into the lit windows of its shops on quiet autumn evenings. Sleep well. The lamp on the bedside table is about to be extinguished. The October night outside the window is settling into its late hours, with the distant sounds of the late city gradually reducing as the early hours pass and the last late carriages and the last late pedestrians find their ways home. The hotel around us is mostly asleep. The Carlton on Pall Mall is closing its grill room for the night. The Empire on Leicester Square has had its lights extinguished an hour ago. The shops along Piccadilly are dark. The pelicans in St. James's Park are asleep on their park island. The lamplighter, who lit the gas lamps on Piccadilly at 4 o'clock this afternoon, is now somewhere in his narrow lodgings in some smaller district of the city, asleep in his own bed. The distant sound of a single hansom passing, somewhere in the streets below, comes faintly through the windows. The line of gas lamps along the south side of Piccadilly is still burning, with the steady gas flames in their glass globes, with the street lamplighter not due to extinguish them until perhaps 5 in the morning when his early round will come. The whole of the city, in its unhurried late way, is settling into the slow rhythms of the night that, in the way of all great cities, never quite stops, but which slows in the late hours to the distant pulse that the sleeping inhabitants of any particular bed in any particular hotel can hear, very faintly through the narrow windows that face the streets, when they are settling, as we are now settling, into the slow, careful descent into sleep. The day is done. The evening is done. The night is here. The bedside lamp is going out. The October dark is closing in. The story, in the unhurried way of the houses and the streets and the cities that know how to keep their stories, goes on. Good night.